There is a war that most people never see in the history books. Not the war of beaches and tank columns and cities reduced to rubble. A different war, a quieter one, fought in total darkness, in freezing water, thousands of meters from the nearest coastline, where no correspondent filed a report and no photographer captured the moment. A war decided, not by the courage of soldiers on any visible front, but by the slow, grinding mathematics of ships that arrived and ships that did not. This is that war. At its heart was a single, brutal question. Could Germany sink Allied merchant vessels faster than the Allies could build them, crew them, and sail them across the North Atlantic? Everything else, the armies massing in Britain, the factories running around the clock in America, the plans for the eventual liberation of occupied Europe, all of it depended on the answer, because none of it could move, none of it could be fed, none of it could be armed without the ships. The ships were the war, and for a period measured not in days but in years, Germany came terrifyingly close to stopping them. The story you are about to hear spans more than 6 years of ocean warfare. It moves from the drawing rooms of German naval headquarters in the 1930s, where a lean, precise officer named Karl Dönitz was quietly working out a theory that most of his superiors thought impractical, all the way through to the spring of 1945, when the last U-boats were sailing on patrols, from which the crews already understood they were unlikely to return. Between those 2 points lies one of the most complex, most consequential, and most quietly devastating campaigns in the history of modern war. It involves cryptography and mathematics, sleep deprivation and mechanical failure, industrial policy and inter-service politics. It involves young men, most of them in their early 20s, sealed inside steel cylinders, roughly 67 meters long, running without lights through the North Atlantic in the middle of winter, listening for the sounds of propellers above them, and counting the seconds between depth-charge detonations. It involves exhausted convoy escort commanders nursing ships, held together with repairs, across an ocean that was simultaneously trying to kill them through weather and through human ingenuity. And it involves the quiet, unsung machinery of intelligence. Rooms full of civilians in a country house in rural England, working through the night on problems that, if solved, might redirect entire convoys away from waiting submarines, and if not solved in time, would send hundreds of sailors to the bottom before morning. The Wolf Pack was the idea that made all of this possible for Germany. It sounds almost simple when you state it plainly. Rather than sending one submarine to hunt alone, send many. Spread them in a line across an expected convoy route. When the first boat finds the target, it does not attack. It holds back, submerges, follows, and signals its position to a headquarters on shore. That headquarters, using the information from the shadowing boat, broadcasts orders to every other submarine within range, drawing them in like a tightening net. And then, when the pack is assembled, the attack comes, not from one direction, from several, simultaneously, at night. On the surface, where the acoustic detection equipment carried by the escorts cannot find them. It was elegant, it was lethal, and for a period of roughly 2 years, it worked so well that the men who would eventually have to stop it were forced to confront the possibility that it could not be stopped at all. Britain in 1939 was, in a way that its own population only partially understood, one of the most logistically fragile nations on Earth. An island of roughly 47 million people, unable to feed itself from its own soil, unable to arm itself without raw materials, drawn from every corner of a trading empire that stretched across oceans. Every week, every day, convoys of merchant ships crossed the Atlantic carrying the food, the fuel, the steel, the weapons, and the components without which the nation would, within months, cease to be able to fight. The British Admiralty had known this before the war began. They had studied the mathematics, they had the numbers, and those numbers were frightening. Germany knew them too. That is what makes this story so remarkable and so dark. The strategic logic was understood by both sides before the first shot was fired. The question was only whether Germany could exploit it fast enough, and whether Britain could hold on long enough for help to arrive. And help, when it came slowly. It came in the form of American industrial capacity that took time to mobilize. It came in the form of technology that took months and years to develop, test, and deploy. It came in the form of intelligence that had to be stolen, broken, and decoded under pressure. And it came in some of the most important moments of the entire campaign, in the form of decisions made by individual men on the bridges of small escort vessels in the middle of the Atlantic, men who chose to stay and fight rather than run. This documentary tells that entire story, from beginning to end. 18 chapters, more than 6 years of war, every phase of the campaign, from the early individual successes of 1939 through the devastating efficiency of the wolf packs at their peak, through the crisis of March 1943, when the system nearly broke, through the sudden reversal of Black May, and the long, grinding, costly decline that followed. We will follow the technology on both sides as it evolved in real time, each innovation answered by a countermeasure, each countermeasure forcing a new response. We will follow the intelligence war being fought in parallel, the Enigma machine and the men and women who broke it, the convoy routing decisions made on the basis of decrypts that could never be acknowledged. And we will follow the human cost, on both sides, of a campaign that consumed lives with a statistical thoroughness that makes it one of the deadliest sustained military operations of the Second World War. If you are here for a long, absorbing journey through one of history's most consequential and most neglected campaigns, then settle in. Turn the lights down. Let the Atlantic find its rhythm. This is not a story that rushes, because the ocean never rushed, and neither did the men who sailed it. What it offers instead is depth, the quiet kind, the kind that stays with you. And if this is the kind of content that pulls you in, serious, thorough, built for long nights and curious minds, then stay with us. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a great deal more where this comes from. The war beneath the Atlantic is waiting. It begins with an island that could not survive alone, and a man with a theory that the world was not yet ready to take seriously. It ends in the deep water, where it has always been. Let us go back to the beginning. There is a version of the Second World War that lives in the memory as a war of armies, of lines drawn across maps, of cities taken and surrendered, of infantry moving through smoke and mud towards some defined and visible objective. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters enormously, because beneath all of it, sustaining every soldier and every factory and every meal eaten by a civilian in a blacked-out kitchen, ran something older and more fundamental than any land campaign. It ran through water, cold, grey, indifferent Atlantic water, stretching roughly 3,000 miles between the British Isles and the ports of North America. And the question of who controlled that water, or more precisely, who could deny it to whom, was not a secondary concern in the Second World War. It was the war's deepest question. Everything else was negotiation around its answer. Britain, in 1939, was, in the most literal physical sense, a nation that could not feed itself from its own soil. The islands are not large. The population was, by that point, approaching 47 million people, a figure that had grown far beyond what domestic agriculture could sustain, even in the best harvest years. Roughly 55 million tons of imported goods were required every single year, simply to keep the country functioning at a basic level. And that was before accounting for the vast additional weight of war materials, fuel, weapons components, and industrial raw supplies that a nation mobilized for total war would need to absorb. Grain came from North America and the Commonwealth. Oil came from the Western Hemisphere. Iron ore came from Scandinavia and beyond. Cotton, rubber, timber, copper, the arteries of any modern industrial economy, all of them had to cross open ocean to reach British ports. Remove those imports, or reduce them sufficiently and for long enough, and Britain did not merely struggle. Britain stopped. The British Admiralty had understood this with uncomfortable clarity for decades before the war began. Studies conducted in the interwar years turned over the numbers with the dispassion of actuaries and arrived at conclusions that were difficult to sit with calmly. There were threshold figures, minimum tonnage levels below which the civilian population would face starvation conditions, below which the war industries would fall silent for lack of raw materials, below which the armed forces themselves could not be maintained in the field. These thresholds were not vague estimates. They had been calculated with reasonable precision, and the calculations revealed a margin of vulnerability that was, depending on how honestly one looked at it, either sobering or terrifying. Britain could absorb losses. It could absorb significant losses. But there was a flaw, and below that flaw lay national collapse. What made this vulnerability so strategically acute was the nature of the ocean crossing itself. The North Atlantic in wartime is not a hospitable environment under any circumstances. It is a place of enormous fetch and violent weather, of seas that rise to heights that dwarf the vessels crossing them, of cold so penetrating that a man in the water without a survival suit loses consciousness within minutes. Merchant ships crossing those waters in convoy were slow, often heavily laden, and dependent on escort forces that were never, in the early years of the war, anything approaching adequate to the task. The routes themselves were effectively fixed by geography and by the limitations of the ships using them, predictable in their broad outlines, running through waters where a submarine commander with the right positioning could wait with something approaching patience. The ocean's very immensity, which might seem to offer concealment, also offered concealment to those who hunted across it. Germany's naval planners had looked at precisely the same geography and arrived at their own conclusions, and those conclusions were mirror images of the Admiralty's fears. If Britain's survival depended on the Atlantic sea lanes, then those sea lanes were Britain's most exposed and most attackable strategic asset, more exposed than its cities, more vulnerable than its airfields, more consequential in the long run than any single military installation. A campaign aimed at severing or sufficiently degrading those supply routes did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in open battle. It did not require a German army to land on English beaches or fight its way through the English countryside. It required only attrition, sustained, systematic, mathematically relentless destruction of the ships that carried the imports, applied over enough time to drive Britain's import tonnage below the survivable threshold. This was not a dramatic or emotionally satisfying vision of warfare. There were no flags planted on hills, no cavalry charges, no decisive engagements that future historians would write about with uncomplicated admiration. There was only arithmetic, but arithmetic, applied patiently and in the right place, could end the war. The instrument of that arithmetic, as German naval thinking had recognized since the First World War, was the submarine. Surface warships could be engaged and sunk by the Royal Navy, which remained a formidable force even in its interwar reduced state. Aircraft were range-limited and weather-dependent, but a submarine operating beneath the surface of the ocean could approach convoys without detection by contemporary means, strike without warning from positions that surface forces could not effectively guard against, and withdraw into the three-dimensional darkness of deep water before a counterattack could be properly organized. The First World War had demonstrated all of this with brutal clarity. German submarines had come, in the view of those who studied the campaign honestly afterward, remarkably close to breaking Britain's supply lines entirely, close enough that the British government had, at certain moments in 1917, been genuinely alarmed about the nation's ability to continue the war. The convoy system, implemented belatedly in that conflict, had blunted the campaign significantly. But the lesson the German naval establishment absorbed was not that submarines were ineffective. It was that they had been deployed too late, in insufficient numbers, without adequate coordination, against an enemy who had eventually found a partial answer. Change those conditions, and the result might be different. What neither side had fully worked through in the interwar years, and what would consume much of the strategic thinking of the early war period, was the question of scale. How many ships would have to be sunk per month, sustained over what period, to drive British imports below the critical threshold? How many submarines would be required to achieve that rate of destruction against an enemy running a convoy system with adequate escorts? These calculations were not simple. They depended on variables that shifted constantly: the number of escort vessels available, the performance of detection technology on both sides, the weather, the routing decisions made by naval commands on the basis of intelligence. But the fundamental logic held, regardless of the precise numbers. This was going to be a tonnage war, a war measured in cargo, in holds full of grain and oil and steel, in the difference between what Britain needed to survive and what it could actually get across 3,000 miles of contested ocean. There was one further dimension to the strategic picture that would shape everything that followed, and it was a dimension that existed largely in silence during the years before the fighting began. Both the Admiralty and the German Naval Command were working from their respective analyses, conducting their planning exercises, and writing their theoretical papers in the language of tonnage and patrol areas and convoy routing. But beneath that analytical vocabulary was a human reality that the numbers only partially captured. The ships crossing the Atlantic were not abstractions. They were crewed by men, merchant sailors from Britain, from Canada, from the United States, from Norway, from Greece, from dozens of other nations, whose shipping had been pressed into the common effort. They were ordinary working men, not military personnel in most cases, sailing freighters and tankers through water that was trying to kill them in ways both physical and mechanical. The strategic calculus that treated their cargoes as variables in an equation treated those men, by implication, as variables too. What was about to begin was a campaign of enormous technical and organizational sophistication, operating against a background of individual human experience that the planning documents were never quite adequate to describe. By the time September of 1939 arrived, and the calculations became operational, the broad outlines of what was going to happen were already visible to anyone who had done the arithmetic carefully. Britain needed those imports. Germany needed to stop them. The Atlantic was the arena, and the submarine was Germany's chosen instrument. What remained to be determined, what would consume 4 years and more of fighting, invention, counter-invention, death, and desperate improvisation, was whether one side's strategy could outpace the other's capacity to adapt. The gap between what Germany's submarines could theoretically achieve and what Britain's defenses could theoretically absorb was not enormous. It was narrow enough to be genuinely alarming, wide enough to be genuinely contested, and for long stretches of the war, close enough that the outcome was not a foregone conclusion in either direction. That is the essential truth that gives this campaign its particular weight. The men who sent convoys out, and the men who hunted them, were not engaged in a sideshow. They were engaged in the central contest of the European war, playing for stakes that could not have been higher if the game had been fought on the beaches of Normandy itself. In the depths of the Atlantic, unseen and largely uncelebrated, the war's most consequential argument was about to begin. There is a particular kind of man who survives disaster not by forgetting it, but by turning it over and over in his mind until it becomes something else entirely, not a wound, but a blueprint. Karl Dönitz was that kind of man. He was born in a small town east of Berlin in the autumn of 1891, the son of an engineer, and he grew up in the ordered, industrious world of Wilhelmina, Germany, a world that expected its young men to serve and expected service to mean something. He entered the Imperial Navy as a junior officer before the First World War, and by the time that war had ground into its middle years, he had found his way into submarines, not because it was a comfortable posting, but because it was where the fighting was sharpest and the stakes were most nakedly visible. He proved himself a capable, aggressive commander, the kind who pressed his attacks and kept his nerve in the cold, close dark of a steel tube running beneath the surface of the Mediterranean. He was not yet the architect of anything. He was still just a hunter, learning the shape of his instincts. His captaincy ended not in triumph, but in capture. In the autumn of 1918, his boat suffered a catastrophic malfunction while attacking a convoy near Malta, and Dönitz and his surviving crew were taken prisoner by the British. He spent the final weeks of the war and the months that followed in an Allied internment camp. And in that enforced stillness, something began to crystallize. He had time to think about what had gone wrong on his own boat, but more broadly, about what had gone wrong with Germany's submarine campaign as a whole. The campaign had sunk enormous tonnage and had brought Britain genuinely close to crisis, yet it had not been enough. Individual submarines, hunting alone, had been too easy to evade, too easy to destroy once the British escorted their merchant traffic and organized their defenses. One boat could be tracked, cornered, driven off, or killed. But what if the attack could not be focused into one point? What if the convoy's defenders could not know from which direction the killing blow would come? The question lodged itself in Dönitz's mind like a splinter, too deep to ignore and too sharp to leave alone. He returned to Germany in the summer of 1919 and found a country that barely resembled the one he had left. The Treaty of Versailles had done its surgical work on German military power. The Navy was permitted only a handful of surface vessels below specified tonnage limits. Submarines were banned outright. Germany was forbidden from owning, building, or operating them. The entire apparatus of underwater warfare that had nearly strangled Britain was supposed to have been dismantled and dispersed into the past. For a man who had spent the war beneath the waves, this was not merely a professional restriction, it was an amputation, and yet Dönitz continued to serve in the reduced navy, working in surface ship roles through the 1920s, rising quietly through the ranks, and never quite letting go of the question that had come to him in that internment camp. The ban on submarines did not silence the thinking. If anything, it gave the thinking more room. Through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, German naval planners were already working around the restrictions of Versailles, with the careful ingenuity that necessity produces. A covert submarine design and construction program had been established through arrangements with foreign partners, most notably with a Dutch engineering firm that served as a front for German technical work. The knowledge was being kept alive in drawing offices and workshops well beyond German borders. Officers who would need to command submarines were being identified and quietly prepared, their theoretical education proceeding, even though there was nothing yet for them to command. Dönitz followed all of this with professional interest, but his contribution during this period was less technical than conceptual. He was thinking about how submarines should be used, not merely how they should be built, and the distinction would prove to be the more important one. The theoretical core of what would become the Wolf Pack was not complicated. Its power lay in its clarity. A single submarine attacking a convoy faced an escort force that could concentrate every available asset, every destroyer, every depth charge pattern, every aegis beam, against that single threat. The submarine's advantages of concealment and surprise could be neutralized by the escort's ability to focus its response. But if 6 submarines attacked simultaneously from different bearings, the defenders faced a problem with no clean solution. The escorts could not be everywhere. The convoy's perimeter could not be held against coordinated pressure from multiple directions at once. The arithmetic favored the attacker in ways that grew more pronounced the more boats were added to the pack. Dönitz worked through this mathematics in his writing and his thinking throughout the late 1920s, not as a finished operational plan, but as a developing argument, a case he was building against the day when he might have the resources to test it. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the winter of 1933, and German rearmament shifted from covert to open, Dönitz's world changed in the most immediate practical sense. The prohibition on submarines was not officially repudiated until the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935, but preparations had been accelerating for some time before that public acknowledgement. Dönitz was given command of the new submarine flotilla, effectively a single boat and the skeleton of an organization, and set about building the U-boat arm with an energy that observers described as consuming. He was not simply organizing a unit. He was inscribing a culture, establishing from the first day the principles of aggressiveness, technical proficiency, and personal initiative that he believed the coming campaign would require. He selected his crews carefully, trained them relentlessly, and subjected them to exercises that were designed to be more demanding than anything they would face in actual combat. If they could perform under simulated crisis, the theory went, the real thing would not break them. The war games and exercises of the mid-1930s were where the Wolf Pack moved from theory to procedure. Dönitz ran exercises in the Baltic and the North Sea, in which groups of submarines practiced the full cycle of pack operations. The dispersed patrol line stretched across a convoy's expected route, the contact report transmitted by the first boat to find the target, the surfaced high-speed run by the other boats to converge on the position, the coordinated night attack from multiple directions while the escorts struggled to cover all vectors simultaneously. He refined the communications protocols that made coordination possible, the short, precise radio messages that would allow boats spread across hundreds of kilometers of ocean to act in concert without revealing too much to anyone listening. He recorded what worked and what failed, adjusted the procedures, and ran the exercises again. He was, in effect, writing a manual for a kind of warfare that had never been attempted at scale. But the exercises also exposed the central political obstacle that Dönitz would fight for the rest of the decade. The German Naval High Command, the Oberkommando der Marine, was dominated in its strategic thinking by advocates of a powerful surface fleet. Admiral Erich Raeder, the Navy's commander-in-chief, was not hostile to submarines as a component of naval power, but his vision of Germany's future at sea centered on capital ships, on battleships and cruisers that could challenge British naval supremacy in direct fleet engagements and project German power across the world's oceans. The submarine arm was, in this view, useful but secondary. Dönitz argued with consistent force that this priority was strategically wrong for Germany's situation, that Britain's true vulnerability lay not in its battle fleet, but in its merchant shipping, and that sinking merchant ships, in sufficient numbers, fast enough, was the only path to forcing a decision before British industrial and imperial resources overwhelmed German capability. He lost the argument, year after year, in the budget cycles and planning conferences that determined how the limited resources of German rearmament would be allocated. The consequences of that argument's outcome were concrete and severe. When war came, in September of 1939, Dönitz had roughly 57 operational submarines, where his calculations had told him he needed at least 300 to wage the tonnage war with decisive effect. Of those available boats, fewer than half were the Type 7 U-boat, the medium-range workhorse that was well suited to Atlantic operations, while many of the remainder were smaller coastal types with limited range and endurance. The surface fleet advocates had argued that war would not come so soon, that there was time to build the balanced force that Raeder envisioned through the long-term construction program known as Plan Z. History had not cooperated with that timeline. Hitler's political timetable and the surface fleet's priorities had collided in the worst possible way for Dönitz's vision, leaving him with an instrument that was sharp but dangerously short. There was a bitter irony threaded through this situation that Dönitz understood with complete clarity. His ideas had been judged interesting, but insufficiently funded. His exercises had demonstrated the pack's potential against simulated targets, while the real program of construction had been directed elsewhere. And yet the strategic logic he had been arguing for a decade was, if anything, more valid in September of 1939 than it had been when he first formulated it. Britain was still an island. It still depended on imported food, oil, and raw materials to an extent that made the seaways existential. The convoy system, however effective, still had gaps that could be exploited by boats operating in coordination. What Dönitz lacked was not the idea. He never lacked the idea, but the means to execute it at the scale the mathematics demanded. He would go to war with what he had, and he would press the attack regardless, and he would continue arguing for the resources his vision required, even as his crews were already dying to demonstrate its potential. What those early years of preparation had given Dönitz, beyond tactics and communications protocols and crew selection criteria, was something harder to quantify. It was a particular relationship with the men who served under him, a relationship built on the understanding that he was asking them to accept extreme danger in the service of a strategic idea he believed in, with something approaching religious conviction. He visited the boats, he met the crews, he attended the departures and the returns that grew fewer as the war progressed, and he maintained a correspondence with his commanders that was personal in its tone and unambiguous in its expectations. The U-boat arm was not, in his conception, simply another branch of the armed forces. It was the instrument of a theory he had carried since a cold, failed night in the Mediterranean more than 2 decades earlier. The idea had survived defeat, internment, a treaty designed to kill it, and a decade of institutional resistance from within his own service. It had survived because one man had refused to let it die. What the Atlantic would do to that idea, to that man, and to the thousands of young men who came to embody it, was a question the ocean had not yet answered. Germany was not supposed to have submarines. The Treaty of Versailles had been explicit on that point, stripping the German Navy down to a handful of surface vessels and forbidding the construction or possession of any underwater craft whatsoever. For the architects of the post-war settlement, this was a deliberate wound, a surgical removal of the weapon that had nearly strangled Britain between 1914 and 1918. But treaties, as history repeatedly demonstrates, are only as durable as the will to enforce them. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Germany found ways to keep the knowledge alive, the expertise intact, and the ambition quietly burning beneath a compliant surface. Naval officers studied submarine design under the cover of consulting arrangements. Technical drawings migrated to foreign shipyards in friendly countries. The German Navy could not build submarines on German soil, so it built the understanding of how submarines were built, and it waited. The subterfuge had institutional form. A design bureau, established through a Dutch front company, became the repository for German submarine engineering expertise throughout the Weimar years. German engineers contributed to submarine construction contracts in other nations, Finland, Turkey, Spain, each project serving as a floating classroom where skills were maintained and innovations quietly tested. This was not a conspiracy of shadowy figures working against their own government. It was, in large part, a sanctioned program, understood and approved by successive German administrations that regarded the Versailles restrictions as temporary humiliations rather than permanent conditions. The technical knowledge accumulated in this period meant that when the political climate finally shifted, Germany did not need to relearn submarine construction from first principles. The expertise was there, assembled, catalogued, and ready. When Adolf Hitler repudiated the Versailles restrictions in 1935 and the Anglo-German naval agreement was signed that same year, a bilateral arrangement that effectively conceded German submarine parity up to British tonnage levels, the consequence was swift and visible. Boats that had existed as blueprints and as components stored in warehouses were assembled openly. The first vessels emerged from German yards within months, not years, because the groundwork had been laid so thoroughly. Karl Dönitz, appointed to command this resurgent submarine force, inspected his new command with a professional's eye. What he found was promising in its nucleus, but desperately thin in its numbers. He had done the mathematics. He knew how many boats he would need to wage the kind of campaign he envisioned, and what he had fell far short of that figure by every measure. The boat that would define the U-boat war in its most intense years was the Type 7, and it was, by any honest assessment, a formidable piece of engineering inside severe constraints. It displaced roughly 750 tons when surfaced, and somewhat more when submerged. Its length ran to approximately 67 meters, cramped, functional, purposeful. On the surface, its diesel engines drove it at speeds approaching 17 knots, giving it the mobility to reposition and pursue. Submerged, it slowed dramatically, limited to roughly 8 knots on its electric motors, and its underwater endurance was measured in hours rather than days. This was the fundamental reality that shaped everything. The Type 7 was a submersible surface vessel, not a true submarine in the modern sense. It lived on the surface, hunted on the surface, and dove only when forced to. Its designed patrol range carried it into the North Atlantic and back with a workable margin. It carried a complement of 14 torpedoes when fully loaded, and its deck gun gave it an alternative against smaller, unescorted targets. The boat was good. The question was whether there would ever be enough of them, and whether they would arrive before the strategic window closed. The interior of a Type 7 was an education in human endurance. 60 men, in later war configurations sometimes fewer, occupied a pressure hull roughly the diameter of a modest living room corridor. Every cubic centimeter served a purpose. Torpedoes were stowed beneath bunks. Food supplies filled every available cavity at the start of a patrol, hanging from the overhead, wedged between machinery housings, stacked in the forward torpedo room, where crews slept among the weapons they would fire. As provisions were consumed over the first weeks, the boat slowly became marginally less suffocating. Humidity was a constant companion, condensation running down the interior steel in fine rivulets, soaking clothing and equipment alike. The smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, bilge water, and cooking accumulated into something that veterans remembered with particular vividness for the rest of their lives. Men who chose this existence did so knowingly, and they chose it in significant numbers. The selection process that filled those bunks was deliberate and demanding. Volunteers were the rule, not the exception, and the U-boat arm was consistently oversubscribed throughout the early war years. Candidates who passed initial screening were evaluated for technical aptitude, psychological steadiness, and the capacity for both independent judgment and absolute reliability under pressure, qualities that could seem contradictory but were both genuinely required in a submarine commander. The training pipeline was long. Officers spent months studying naval engineering, navigation, torpedo mechanics, and signals procedure before they ever went to sea in a submarine. Petty officers and ratings underwent parallel streams of specialized instruction. When a crew assembled for the first time, each man already knew his equipment at a level that made him something approaching an expert in his specific domain. The Navy Dönitz was building was not designed to be large. It was designed to be relentlessly competent. The exercises that completed this preparation were conducted in the Baltic, where U-boat crews drilled against German surface vessels and each other in conditions designed to approximate combat as closely as peacetime could manage. The diving times crews achieved through repetition became a point of fierce pride. The interval between a surfaced boat receiving an alarm and achieving safe depth was measured in seconds, and fractions of seconds were competed over with an intensity that reflected genuine understanding of what slow diving times meant in combat. Attack runs against simulated convoys, navigation exercises in restricted waters, damage control drills that forced crews to manage flooding in partial darkness. The training was physically and mentally exhausting by design. The logic was explicit. Exhaustion in training was recoverable. Exhaustion in the Atlantic, at the wrong moment, was not. Dönitz's command philosophy permeated this training environment from its foundations. He had drawn precise lessons from the First World War experience, including his own command and capture, and he believed he understood exactly where the previous U-boat campaign had fallen short. The fundamental problem, as he saw it, had been individual boats operating alone, attacking only when conditions were personally favorable, breaking off when escort pressure increased. He wanted something fundamentally different. Commanders who understood that their mission was to press the attack regardless of personal discomfort, that their obligation to the convoy's destruction outweighed their obligation to their own boat's immediate safety, and that radio contact reporting was not optional. It was the mechanism by which the whole system functioned. A commander who found a convoy and dived to avoid escorts rather than broadcasting its position had, in Dönitz's moral framework, failed his comrades and his mission simultaneously. This insistence on aggressive initiative was balanced by an equally firm insistence on radio discipline in a specific, carefully defined sense. Boats were not to transmit carelessly or frequently when such transmission served no operational purpose. Every radio message was a potential intelligence gift to the enemy, a bearing that direction-finding equipment could fix, a transmission that could narrow the search area for an aircraft. But when a boat had found a target convoy, when it was in the shadowing position and maintaining contact while headquarters brought other boats to bear, then transmission was mandatory, regardless of risk. The distinction Dönitz drew was between useless chatter and operationally necessary communication, and he drilled that distinction into his commanders until it was reflexive. The paradox, radio silence as default, radio transmission as obligatory at the decisive moment, was one of the subtler pieces of doctrine he had to instill, because the human instinct under threat was silence, not broadcasting. The relationship Dönitz cultivated with his men went beyond normal military hierarchy, and those who served under him consistently described something that resembled, more than anything else, a form of institutional fatherhood. He knew the names of commanders. He met boats returning from patrol personally when he could. He wrote letters. He read patrol reports with the attention of someone genuinely interested in the tactical detail, and he responded with analysis rather than mere approval or criticism. When men died, and from the early months of the war, men began dying, he carried the weight of those losses in a way that his crews understood and that bound them to him through something more durable than regulations. He asked of them things that were objectively dangerous, and they accepted those demands partly because they believed, with reason, that he took those dangers seriously rather than abstractly. By the time German submarines began wartime operations in the autumn of 1939, the U-boat arm was not numerous. Dönitz had argued repeatedly, and had been repeatedly overruled, that the construction program needed to be dramatically larger and faster. He had calculated that a minimum of 300 operational submarines was necessary to wage the kind of sustained interdiction campaign he envisioned, and he had nowhere near that number. What he had instead was a relatively small force of extraordinarily well-trained crews, boats whose technical characteristics were well matched to the tactical system he had designed around them, and a command culture that was, man for man, probably the most cohesive fighting arm that Germany possessed at war's outbreak. The numbers were the problem that never went away, but in those early months, operating against an enemy whose convoy escort forces were thin and whose anti-submarine technology was still finding its feet, the quality of what Dönitz had built would produce results that surpassed even his carefully calculated expectations. The machinery of the Wolfpack was assembled and running. It had not yet been tested at scale. That testing was about to begin. The war was less than 24 hours old when the first ship went down. A passenger liner, westbound and still carrying civilians, was struck without warning in the Atlantic approaches. The loss provoked outrage in neutral capitals and grim satisfaction in a handful of German naval offices, where men had spent years studying exactly these sea lanes on charts worn thin at the folds. For Britain, it was a brutal announcement of what the next 6 years would demand. For Dönitz's submarine commanders, it was confirmation that the weapon they had built, tested, and argued for, across a decade of peacetime frustration, was now free to do what it had been designed to do. The campaign had no formal opening ceremony. It simply began, quietly, with cold water and flame. Through the autumn of 1939, individual U-boats operated across the western approaches and the waters north of Scotland, hunting independently rather than in the coordinated groups Dönitz envisioned as the ultimate expression of his doctrine. The numbers in those first months were encouraging enough to sustain belief in the strategy, even while the Wolfpack concept remained largely theoretical. Merchant ships sailing without escort and without the protection of routing changes were located, tracked, and sunk with a regularity that alarmed the Admiralty even as it gratified BDU. The Type 7 and its crews were performing exactly as the pre-war exercises had suggested they would against unprotected trade. Each report radioed back to shore told the same story. Independent ships were almost defenseless, and there were still far too many of them sailing alone. The British had not forgotten the First World War. Within days of the declaration of war, the Admiralty moved to reinstate the convoy system that had, a generation earlier, transformed the arithmetic of submarine warfare from a near-Allied catastrophe into a manageable problem. The logic was straightforward and had been proved in blood. A submarine hunting a vast ocean found individual ships with difficulty, but a gathered convoy presented a single target that required finding only once, and the escorts clustering around that target could make the attack expensive. The institutional memory existed. The doctrine was on paper. What was not yet in place was the hardware, the escort vessels, the trained crews, the aircraft patrols, the communication networks that made a convoy system genuinely protective rather than merely symbolic. Britain began the war with the idea of the system already functioning. It would spend the next 3 years building the substance to match it. The early escort forces were painfully thin. Destroyers that might otherwise have screened convoys were allocated to fleet duties, to anti-invasion patrols after the fall of France in the summer of 1940, and to the 100 other demands a navy at war generates simultaneously. The vessels that did escort convoys in the opening phase were often older, slower, and less well-equipped than the task demanded. Corvettes of the Flower class were entering service in growing numbers, small, sturdy, and designed for exactly this work. But their crews were new to the business, and the boats themselves were brutally uncomfortable in Atlantic weather, rolling so heavily that men learned to eat, sleep, and fight at angles that would have seemed comic in peacetime. The gap between having a convoy system and having an effective one was measured not in policy, but in the lived experience of those ships and the men aboard them. The technical instrument on which British anti-submarine strategy rested was ASDIC, the underwater sound-ranging equipment that had been developed since the First World War, and which the Royal Navy believed, with a confidence that sometimes bordered on complacency, gave its escorts a decisive advantage over submerged submarines. ASDIC transmitted a pulse of sound through the water and detected the echo returning from a submerged hull, giving the operator bearing and approximate range. It was a genuine capability, not a fiction, and in the right conditions against a stationary or slow-moving target, it functioned well enough. German submarine commanders quickly discovered its limitations, and those limitations shaped their tactical thinking for years to come. ASDIC struggled at high speeds and in rough water. It provided bearing, but not depth with precision. Most critically, it was almost useless against a submarine operating on the surface, where U-boats rode at night with near invisibility against a dark Atlantic horizon. The night surface attack was not an invention born of wartime desperation. It was a calculated response to the technology facing the U-boats, worked out in Dönitz's pre-war exercises, and now being validated repeatedly in the operational zone. A U-boat on the surface was faster than when submerged, could maneuver more freely, and presented a profile so low that visual detection by an escort lookout was extraordinarily difficult in anything less than ideal conditions. The ASDIC sets that crews had trained on for years fell silent the moment a U-boat chose the surface. British destroyer commanders, who had drilled confidently on the assumption that their detection equipment was the decisive variable, found themselves groping for an enemy that had simply refused to fight on those terms. The cat had claws. The mouse had learned not to be underwater. Then came Scapa Flow. In the middle of October 1939, a single U-boat threaded its way through what the Royal Navy considered the secure anchorage of its home fleet in the Orkney Islands, north of Scotland. The defences were imperfect, the channels inadequately blocked, and one German commander had studied the approaches with extraordinary care. He brought his boat in on the surface during the darkness of an autumn night, found a capital ship at anchor, fired his torpedoes, and exited before the anchorage had fully understood what had happened. The battleship Royal Oak sank with the loss of more than 800 of her crew. The shock to British naval prestige was profound and immediate. A fleet anchorage that had anchored the entire strategic posture of the Grand Fleet in the previous war had been violated by a single submarine, and the men who had believed in the security of those waters paid the price in cold northern darkness. The effect on German public morale was out of all proportion to the military significance of a single ship. The commander returned to a welcome that made front pages across Germany and provided Dönitz with something he badly needed beyond the tactical result: proof of concept for what aggressive submarine command could achieve, presented in terms that even the surface fleet admirals who dominated naval funding could not easily dismiss. The Scapa Flow operation was not wolfpack warfare. It was an act of extraordinary individual skill and nerve, but it demonstrated precisely the qualities Dönitz had been demanding of his commanders, and it associated the submarine arm with a kind of bold, penetrating offensive action that generated institutional momentum at the exact moment he needed it. Through the winter and into the spring of 1940, as Germany's armies moved through Scandinavia and then turned west towards France, the U-boats continued their individual patrols, with results that fluctuated but never ceased entirely. The fall of France in June 1940 was a strategic event whose consequences for the Battle of the Atlantic are difficult to overstate. Overnight, the German submarine arm acquired direct access to Atlantic bases on the French Biscay coast. The transit times that had consumed so much of each patrol, the long journey around the north of Scotland, through waters patrolled by British aircraft, before a boat reached the operational zone, were dramatically shortened. U-boats could now be at sea in the western approaches within a day or two of leaving harbour. The effective endurance of each boat on station nearly doubled. Dönitz moved his command structure west to be closer to his crews, and the operational tempo that had been building through the first phase of the war now had the logistical foundation to sustain something far more ambitious. The convoy system had been re-implemented, but its protective value in these opening months was uneven, in ways that reflected the honest limits of what Britain could deploy. Escorts covering the eastern end of an Atlantic crossing handed convoys to the open ocean at a western limit beyond which they could not safely range without running out of fuel before the return. From the other direction, escorts out of Canadian ports covered the western approaches to their own coastline. In between lay a stretch of ocean where convoys sailed with reduced or no escort, dependent on the hope that no U-boat had found them, and on routing instructions from shore that were themselves limited by what British intelligence could determine about submarine positions. It was in this grey zone, physical, tactical, and institutional, that the worst losses of the early war period tended to cluster. The ASDIC duels that did take place when escorts caught a submerged U-boat were educational for both sides, though the lessons were not always the ones either had expected. British escort commanders learned to distrust their own certainty about contact classifications. They learned the cost of breaking off a hunt too early, and they learned what happened to a convoy when its escorts were drawn away and out of position by a contact that turned out to be a thermal layer or a school of fish. German U-boat commanders learnt exactly which maneuvers in which conditions could strip an ASDIC contact, how long to lie still, how deep to run, and how much punishment a Type 7's hull could absorb from depth charges that exploded close but not close enough. It was not yet the systematic, doctrinal learning that would emerge on both sides as the war lengthened. It was empirical knowledge, bought one contact at a time, deposited in the memories of survivors, and occasionally in the official reports that made their way back to shore commands, seeking patterns in the chaos. What the first 10 months of the Atlantic War established was this: The conditions were set for a confrontation whose outcome no one could yet see clearly. Britain had the instinct and the institutional memory of convoy warfare, but not yet the full weight of resources to make it work as it must. Germany had individual submarines of genuine skill and aggression, operating in a target-rich environment, but not yet the coordinated mass that Dönitz believed was the war-winning instrument. Both sides were learning, and both sides were losing men to waters that recorded nothing and remembered everything. The deeper battle, the one that would define whether Britain survived as a fighting nation, was still forming beneath the surface of these early exchanges, gathering towards something that no chart of 1939 could quite have predicted. What was already certain was that the ocean itself had become a front line, as real as any in France or Poland, and that the cost of ignorance on that front was measured not in territory conceded, but in ships and men lost to cold water and the unlit dark. There is a particular quality to the North Atlantic in the small hours of the morning. The horizon dissolves. Sky and sea become a single darkness, broken only by the white fracture of a wave crest here and there, and by the slow, resolute shapes of merchant vessels moving in formation through water that offers no shelter, no concealment, no mercy. For the men aboard those ships in the period running from the middle of 1940 through much of 1941, the darkness was not a comfort. It was the hour the wolves preferred. Karl Dönitz had spent the better part of a decade building toward this moment, and now the conditions aligned in ways he could not entirely have predicted. The fall of France in the summer of 1940 changed the geometry of the war at sea in a single stroke. Where German submarines had previously been forced to make the long transit from Baltic and North Sea ports around the northern tip of the British Isles before reaching Atlantic hunting grounds, they now had access to bases along the French Atlantic coast: Brest, Lorient, La Pallice, Saint-Nazaire. The transit time was cut dramatically. A boat that had once consumed a significant portion of its operational endurance, simply reaching the battlefield, could now spend that fuel hunting. The radius of effective operation expanded westward into precisely the area where British air cover could not follow, and where the escort forces were thinnest, and where the convoys, pressing on regardless, moved in long, patient columns through the dark. The Germans called it the glückliche Zeit, the happy time. It was not a phrase that carried irony for the men who coined it. The mathematics of the period were, from Dönitz's perspective, close to ideal. Allied escort forces remained stretched far beyond what the situation demanded, scrambling to cover convoy routes with vessels that were too few, too old, or too lightly equipped. The ASDIC equipment that British destroyers carried, the sound-ranging system developed to detect submerged submarines, was a genuine capability when a U-boat was beneath the surface and moving slowly. But it was a capability built around one assumption, that the submarine would fight from below. Dönitz had spent years understanding that assumption, and he had designed his tactics entirely around its defeat. His boats would not fight submerged at night. They would come up, ride the surface like small grey wolves, move faster than any submerged boat could manage, and attack in darkness, where ASDIC was blind and lookouts on merchant vessels could barely distinguish a low conning tower from a wave. The mechanics of a wolf pack operation during this period had a quality that was almost architectural in its precision, despite unfolding across hundreds of miles of open ocean with no fixed landmarks, and in conditions that could change within an hour. It began with a search line, Dönitz, operating from his headquarters ashore, the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, known throughout the German Navy simply as BDU, would position a number of boats in a patrol line stretched across the anticipated track of an Allied convoy. The spacing between boats was calculated carefully. Too wide, and a convoy could pass through the gap undetected. Too tight, and submarines were wasted in concentration when they were needed spread across the approach routes. The line waited. Days might pass. Then, from one end of that line, a signal would go out. The contact report was the trigger for everything that followed. The first boat to sight a convoy did not immediately attack. This discipline was central to the entire concept, and Dönitz had drilled it into his commanders until it was instinct. A lone submarine pressing an immediate attack might sink one or two vessels before the escorts drove it down, but a submarine holding position at the edge of the convoy's radar shadow, transmitting regular position updates on short bursts of high-frequency radio, was worth every ship in the pack combined. That boat, the Shadower, became the fixed point around which the entire operation pivoted. Its signals flowed to BDU ashore, where staff officers plotted the convoy's course, calculated its speed, and began transmitting orders directing other boats from across the search area toward the intercept point. The convoy moved. The pack converged. The geometry tightened with every hour. What BDU was doing during those hours of convergence was something closer to conducting than commanding. The headquarters could not see the ocean. It could not see the weather, or the exact state of the escorts, or the specific disposition of the convoy's columns. What it could do was process information, apply calculated estimates, and transmit vectors, compass bearings, speeds, rendezvous positions, to boats scattered across hundreds of miles of water. The U-boat commanders, for their part, were expected to use initiative once they reached the operational area. Dönitz had never wanted automatons. He wanted aggressive captains who understood the intent behind an order and could execute it even when radio communication broke down. The system functioned not as rigid hierarchy, but as distributed aggression, held together by a shared tactical doctrine and absolute confidence in the orchestrating hand at BDU. When the pack had assembled around a convoy, it waited for darkness. This, too, was doctrine. The night surface attack was the signature of the wolf pack method at its most effective, and the escorts of this period had limited tools to defeat it. A surfaced U-boat running at speed through a dark sea presented a radar cross-section that the metric wavelength sets carried by most British escorts in this period could not reliably detect. A lookout with binoculars might catch a conning tower against a whitecap if conditions were perfect, but conditions on the North Atlantic in autumn and winter were almost never perfect. The boats would approach from the dark side, holding the convoy's silhouette against whatever faint light the sky offered. A half-moon, distant starlight, the occasional phosphorescence of disturbed water, and press in close before firing. Torpedoes ran hot and straight at ranges that gave the crew of a targeted vessel almost no time to react. The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, or in rapid succession through a single night. An escort commander on the bridge of his corvette or destroyer, receiving reports of a torpedo detonation to starboard, turning to investigate, dropping depth charges on a suspected contact, turning back. All of this happening as another boat slipped in from a different quadrant and another ship went down. The cognitive and physical demands on the escort groups were brutal. They were not simply hunting submarines. They were managing chaos, making decisions under fire in conditions of near-total sensory deprivation, with their primary detection equipment designed for an entirely different form of attack. The U-boat commanders, by contrast, were running on the surface, with sea room, with speed, and with the initiative that comes from knowing you are the one choosing when and how the engagement begins. The results across this period were staggering. Convoy after convoy suffered losses that, had they been sustained indefinitely, would eventually have become mathematically incompatible with British survival. Ships carrying food, fuel, raw materials, ammunition, aircraft components, and the 10,000 categories of goods that an island nation at war cannot produce alone, went down across the shipping lanes, in numbers that the Admiralty tracked with growing alarm. The tonnage figures accumulated month by month. Some individual convoy battles saw multiple vessels lost in a single night, with survivors left in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage in water so cold that survival was measured in minutes rather than hours. The men aboard the merchant ships were not combatants in any traditional sense. They were stevedores, engineers, cooks, and deckhands who had signed on to move cargo, and they were dying in the North Atlantic at a rate that made their occupation among the most dangerous of the entire war. For the U-boat commanders and their crews, this period generated a mythology that would persist within the arm long after the conditions that created it had vanished forever. Certain commanders accumulated records of tonnage sunk that spread through the flotillas, like a form of competitive electricity. Dönitz cultivated this culture deliberately. He knew that the psychological contract between himself and his crews depended on a sense of elite identity, of belonging to a force that operated at the very edge of what was possible. The Knight's Cross ceremonies, the personal attention he paid to returning commanders, the careful management of morale through correspondence and recognition, all of it fed a self-conception within the U-boat arm that would prove both a tremendous tactical asset and, eventually, a terrible liability. Men who believed they were irreplaceable would keep going into a sea that had quietly become a killing ground, and their belief would be the mechanism of their destruction. The shadows were already there in the happy time, though they were not yet visible to the men living inside it. The very radio traffic that made wolfpack coordination possible was flowing in enormous volume across the Atlantic, and it was all being recorded. The conviction within German naval intelligence that Enigma-enciphered signals were unbreakable was not a foolish assumption. It was an assessment made by serious cryptanalysts who understood the mathematical complexity involved. But mathematical complexity and practical impossibility are not the same thing, and in the converted mansion at Bletchley, in the English countryside, people were working on exactly that distinction. The signal volumes generated by the happy time, the contact reports, the BDU instructions, the position updates, the operational summaries, were providing something invaluable to those working against the cipher: material. Enormous quantities of material. And in the escort groups learning their trade under fire, in the shipyards beginning to lay down new vessels, in the laboratories developing new instruments of detection, and in the very specific frustration of escort commanders who had begun to understand what they were fighting and had formed clear ideas about how to fight it differently, the foundations of a reversal were being laid. None of that was apparent on a dark North Atlantic night in the winter of 1940, when a torpedo track hissed white through black water toward a laden merchant vessel whose crew did not yet know the pack was there. In that moment, the system Dönitz had imagined and drilled and argued for through the lean years of the 1930s was working exactly as he had always insisted it could. The sea belonged to the wolves. It would not belong to them for much longer. The Atlantic in wartime was not simply an ocean. It was an information battlefield, and the side that could see the furthest, speak the fastest, and hide its intentions the longest would determine which ships reached port and which did not. For the Wolfpack system to function at all, Karl Dönitz needed something that no submarine commander in the history of warfare had ever possessed before him: a reliable, high-speed means of binding dozens of independent boats scattered across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open ocean into a single, coordinated weapon. The answer was radio. Not the short-range tactical chatter of surface fleets operating in visual contact, but a global high-frequency network capable of reaching a submerged boat in the mid-Atlantic from a shore station in occupied France, and of receiving that boat's reply within minutes. It was an audacious technical achievement. It was also, in the end, a noose. The headquarters that controlled this network bore the title Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, Commander of Submarines, known throughout the German Navy simply as BDU. Dönitz had built this organization in his own image, centrally directed, analytically rigorous, and utterly dependent on his personal involvement in the daily operational decisions of the campaign. Early in the war, BDU operated from Germany itself, but as the operational theatre shifted westward after the fall of France in 1940, the headquarters relocated first to Lorient, on the Brittany coast, and later to Paris, placing it closer to both the boats and the communication infrastructure that sustained them. The physical headquarters was a tightly staffed nerve center, walls covered in the large plotting charts on which the positions of every known U-boat at sea, every reported convoy, and every estimated escort disposition were maintained in near real time. Dönitz and his operations staff lived by these charts. Every morning the picture was updated. Every evening the day's signals were reviewed. Every deployment order was drafted against the background of that evolving geographical picture. The operational cycle of a wolf pack began not with action, but with information. A boat at sea might sight smoke on the horizon, or pick up the propeller noise of a large convoy through its hydrophones. The commander's immediate obligation was not to attack, it was to report. A contact signal had to go out to BDU as rapidly as possible, carrying the convoy's estimated position, course, speed, and composition. That transmission might last only seconds, compressed into the shortest possible burst of code, but it had to reach France, and BDU had to receive it clearly enough to act. The communications staff at headquarters would plot the report, calculate the geometry of the situation, and begin issuing movement orders to other boats in the vicinity, directing them ahead of the convoy's track, positioning them in a line through which the target could not pass without entering the killing ground. All of this happened over radio, across distances of sometimes more than 1,500 kilometers, with operators on both ends working around the noise of the sea, atmospheric interference, and the ever-present awareness that someone else might be listening. High-frequency radio carried wolf-pack communications for a fundamental technical reason. At these frequencies, signals could travel enormous distances by bouncing between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, a phenomenon that made global reach possible with transmitters of manageable power. A U-boat running on the surface at night in the mid-Atlantic could raise the shore stations at Lorient or at the powerful relay transmitters elsewhere in occupied Europe with a relatively compact antenna rigged to its conning tower. The flip side of this long-range propagation was equally absolute. Those same signals radiated in all directions simultaneously. Every transmission made by a U-boat at sea was, in principle, audible to any receiver in the world with the right equipment and the right frequency. The Germans understood this perfectly well, and their answer to the problem was not silence. The operational demands of the Wolfpack made silence impossible, but encryption. The cipher machine that stood at the center of German naval communications was the Enigma, and in the confidence of German signals officers, this machine made the intercept problem irrelevant. The Enigma cipher machine was not simply a code. A simple code substitutes letters or groups of letters according to a fixed table, and once an enemy cracks the substitution pattern, every message becomes readable. Enigma worked differently through a system of rotating cipher wheels that altered the substitution with every single key press. Press a letter once, and the machine might produce a different letter. Press the same letter again, and the machine, having stepped its rotors forward one position, might produce something entirely different. The number of possible configurations, rotor order, starting positions, the plugboard connections that added further scrambling, ran into the hundreds of millions. German cryptographers had calculated that even if an enemy possessed an identical machine, deciphering a message without knowing the day's precise settings would take longer than the age of the universe. The naval Enigma variant, used by U-boats, added layers of complexity beyond the standard military version, including an additional rotor that increased the already astronomical number of possible configurations. German faith in this system was not irrational boasting. By the mathematical standards of the 1930s and early 40s, that faith was entirely justified. It simply turned out not to be sufficient. The fatal flaw in the system was not the mathematics of the Enigma machine itself. It was the vast, relentless, inescapable volume of traffic that the BDU communications network generated. A wolf-pack operation against a single convoy might require dozens of individual transmissions. The initial contact report, the acknowledgement from BDU, the movement orders to individual boats, weather observations required by naval meteorologists, situation reports from the shadowing commander, updated position signals as the convoy altered course, requests for clarification, confirmations of attack runs completed, damage and loss reports. Multiply this across all active operations simultaneously. Add the routine administrative signals that sustained boats at sea, fuel states, torpedo expenditure, mechanical defects, crew casualties, and the total volume of naval radio traffic flowing between BDU and its submarines around the clock was extraordinary. Each of these messages had to be enciphered before transmission and deciphered on receipt. Each encipherment required the operator to choose his settings and, critically, to include procedural information at the start of the message that told the receiving operator how to configure his own machine to read it. Those procedural elements, repeated thousands of times in thousands of messages, began to create patterns. Patterns, over time, were the codebreaker's raw material. At Bletchley Park in England, the Government Code and Cipher School had assembled a collection of mathematicians, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, and lateral thinkers, unlike anything that had existed before in the history of intelligence work. They were attacking Enigma not by brute force. The machine's mathematics made brute force futile, but by identifying and exploiting the human and mechanical regularities that inevitably crept into any system operated at scale under pressure, by people following procedures, composing messages in predictable formats, using standard phrases, reporting standard categories of information. A weather report from a U-boat at sea would almost certainly contain certain words in certain positions. A routine position report would follow a standard structure. A message of a given length and originating at a known transmission time from a known approximate location might correspond to a known event picked up by other intelligence. These cribs, predictable stretches of plain text whose cipher equivalent could be identified in the intercepted message, were the entry points through which the mathematical defenses of Enigma could be attacked. BDU's operational culture actively made this problem worse, though no one on the German side could see it at the time. Dönitz's insistence on central control and his personal involvement in operational decisions meant that the radio network was never allowed to fall quiet. When boats were at sea, they reported. When commanders had information, they transmitted it, because that was the standing order, and because the entire tactical system depended on that flow of information reaching headquarters in time to act. There was, within the culture of the U-boat arm, no tradition of extended radio silence, no practice of operating independently on general orders while avoiding transmissions. The wolf pack demanded the opposite. Every boat that found a convoy had a duty to report it immediately and to maintain contact, transmitting as often as necessary to keep BDU and the pack oriented on the target. This was not a failure of discipline. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The design itself was the vulnerability. The German naval communications staff also made regular use of procedural shortcuts that accumulated into exploitable patterns over time. Operators, working long hours under difficult conditions, sometimes repeated message settings, or followed predictable conventions. When choosing the daily configurations, their orders gave them some flexibility over. Training and habit introduced small regularities into what was supposed to be an infinitely variable system. None of these individual shortcuts were catastrophic in isolation. None would have broken the cipher alone. But intelligence, like compound interest, rewards patience and accumulation. Every small pattern, every repeated phrase, every procedural irregularity was being catalogued and cross-referenced at Bletchley against a growing body of intercepted traffic. The decryption capability that would eventually give the Allies the ability to redirect entire convoy systems around waiting wolf packs was being built, incrementally, from exactly this kind of material. The German Naval Command also operated under a set of convictions about Allied capability that were not unreasonable by pre-war standards, but that proved dangerously static once the war began. It was simply not believed at the senior levels of the Kriegsmarine that Allied signals intelligence had achieved or could achieve the kind of real-time decrypt capability that would make naval enigma operationally useless. When convoys occasionally seemed to avoid positioned wolf packs, the explanation sought was almost always operational. A course change by the convoy commodore, bad weather, a patrol aircraft sighting that caused a diversion. The possibility that someone was reading Badu's own orders and moving the convoys accordingly was considered and periodically discussed, but it was never allowed to become the dominant explanation for anomalous events, because to accept it fully would have been to accept that the entire communications architecture of the campaign was compromised. That conclusion was too catastrophic to sit with for long. Meanwhile, the traffic flowed, night and day, across the width of the Atlantic. The high-frequency signals pulsed outward from U-boats and shore stations alike, carrying with them the compressed record of everything the Wolfpack system was doing, planning, and reporting. They were intercepted, they were sorted, they were fed into the analytical machinery at Bletchley and into the parallel operations of Allied naval intelligence. The full power of what was being built in those listening rooms would not be felt immediately, and there would be periods of darkness when changed settings plunged the analysts back into confusion. But the architecture of exploitation had been established. The Wolfpack's greatest strength, its ability to act as a single coordinated weapon across the open ocean, rested entirely on the radio network that connected it. And the radio network, for all its operational brilliance, had been talking without ceasing since the first days of the war, leaving behind it a trail of signal and pattern and recoverable information that stretched back toward the very beginning. The British Navy had inherited from the First World War a profound lesson written in merchant tonnage, sunk, and convoys scattered across the North Atlantic. Yet that lesson, learned at such cost, had been allowed to fade during 2 decades of peace and budgetary constraint. When war came again in 1939, the Royal Navy possessed the theory of convoy escort, but lacked almost everything else. The ships, the training, the doctrine refined through practice, and most critically, the acceptance within its own leadership that defending merchant vessels was work worthy of the Navy's first-rate attention. The initial response to German submarine operations was not systematic organization, but rather improvisation, born of desperation. Destroyers designed for fleet battle and cruisers meant to project power across ocean basins were hastily reassigned to trail behind lumbering merchant convoys at walking speed. These proud warships, their hulls painted for open ocean warfare, found themselves nursemaids to cargo vessels, and many of their captains viewed the assignment with poorly concealed contempt. The Admiralty itself was divided. The traditionalists who commanded the fleet remained convinced that the decisive blow would be struck by battleships and carriers in a great naval engagement, and they fought vigorously against diverting escorts from fleet duties to what they regarded as a secondary mission. Merchant defense seemed unglamorous, peripheral, almost a distraction from the true business of naval warfare. This institutional resistance would take months and heavy losses to overcome. The crews of the escort vessels themselves inhabited a strange space between improvisation and learning. These men, many of them reservists and peacetime volunteers who had never conceived of war, found themselves on the bridge of a corvette or the deck of a minesweeper, adapted hastily into an anti-submarine platform, equipped with instruments whose principles they were still struggling to understand. The ASDIC apparatus, which promised to locate submarines beneath the waves, was a revolutionary technology, but it did not work as advertised. It had a minimum range below which it became unreliable, a dead zone immediately around the escort ship itself where a U-boat might hide. It performed poorly in rough seas. Operators required training that was in desperately short supply, and they often misinterpreted the signals reflecting back from the ocean floor as signatures of enemy vessels. Officers who had spent their careers studying naval tactics under Nelson and Collingwood now had to learn a fundamentally new form of warfare conducted against an invisible enemy at close range. There were no textbooks because the textbooks had not yet been written. There was no agreed doctrine because doctrine emerges from accumulated experience, and this experience was still being purchased in blood. The early convoys were escorted by ships whose captains often disagreed about basic questions of how to respond to a U-boat attack, where escorts should be positioned relative to the merchant fleet, and how aggressively they should prosecute a detected submarine. Each convoy became a small experiment in tactical innovation. Yet from the chaos of those early months, patterns began to emerge. The most aggressive and intellectually restless escort commanders started to challenge the conventional wisdom that a U-boat, once detected and driven to depth, should be allowed to slip away. The established doctrine held that once a submarine submerged, it had escaped. The convoy would increase speed, alter course, and the escort would break off the hunt to resume station protecting the merchantmen. This logic made sense from a certain angle. The escort's primary duty was to guard the convoy, not to chase a single enemy submarine. But U-boat commanders were methodical. If they broke off one attack and the convoy simply steamed away, they would surface, work themselves ahead of the merchant ships using their superior surface speed, and attack again. The cycle would repeat, and eventually the convoy would suffer losses. A handful of escort commanders began to reason differently. If you drove a U-boat to depth, you had a window, perhaps an hour, perhaps longer, before it could restore full capability. If you kept attacking, kept forcing the submarine down, kept the pressure on without respite, you might exhaust its batteries or damage it sufficiently that it would have to break off and limp away for repairs. This shift from passive defense to active pursuit represented a revolution in escort thinking, though it happened piecemeal and informally across dozens of individual convoys. The transformation accelerated through 1940 and into 1941. As the technological picture began to shift, the introduction of HF/DF, high-frequency direction-finding equipment, was a watershed moment. This apparatus could detect the radio transmissions of a U-boat reporting contact to shore headquarters. When a German submarine broadcast its position and the composition and course of the convoy it had found, it was simultaneously revealing its own location to any Allied escort within range of the HF/DF set. The equipment was crude and temperamental. The bearing it provided was often imprecise. But for the first time, escorts possessed a means of finding a U-boat that was actively engaging in the radio chatter that Dönitz's Wolfpack system required. A U-boat that transmitted a contact report was taking a calculated risk, advertising its position to the very ships that might hunt it down. The most aggressive escort captains learned to read the HF/DF display as a hunting aid. When a bearing pointed toward where a contact report had originated, escorts would head toward that position at speed, forcing U-boats to submerge before they could position themselves optimally for attack. This technology, simple as it seems in retrospect, fundamentally altered the tactical balance. It gave escorts a tool to take the offensive, and they seized upon it. The growing emphasis on aggressive counterattack created pressure for escorts to work in organized groups, rather than as individual ships scattered across a convoy's perimeter. A single destroyer or corvette attempting to hunt a submerged U-boat to exhaustion faced inherent limitations. Its sonar operator might lose contact in the vastness of the ocean. A single depth charge attack, however perfectly executed, might fail to kill or even damage the submarine. But a coordinated group of escorts, working together under a single command, could maintain pressure, could take turns, providing sonar contact, while others rested their operators, could concentrate their attacks on a single target. This reasoning led to the gradual formalization of escort groups, collections of 3, 4, sometimes 5 or more vessels, assigned to work together over multiple convoys, their captains and crews developing a shared understanding of tactics and mutual expectations. The Royal Canadian Navy, in particular, became innovators in escort group doctrine, driven partly by the enormous volume of North Atlantic convoys that departed from Canadian ports, and partly by the particular character of Canadian naval officers who were younger, less bound by Royal Navy tradition, and more willing to experiment. A Canadian captain might devise a tactic that seemed unconventional by Admiralty standards, but if it worked, if it protected merchant ships and damaged U-boats, it would be documented, shared, and gradually incorporated into the broader corpus of escort practice. The support group concept emerged from the recognition that escorts directly attached to convoys operated under a constraint. Their duty was to remain with the merchant ships, to maintain a protective screen, and this duty prevented them from pursuing U-boats away from the convoy. If an escort broke off to hunt a U-boat at distance, the convoy's screen weakened, opening an opportunity for other submarines to attack. What was needed was a second layer of escorts, ships with the freedom to hunt independently and aggressively without the responsibility of remaining with the merchant vessels. These support groups, typically 2 or 3 larger escorts, often frigates or old destroyers, would be positioned ahead of expected convoy routes or behind them, ready to race toward any known U-boat contact and prosecute it vigorously. The support group could hunt without constraint, could sustain an attack for hours if necessary, could accept the casualties inherent in driving a U-boat to the surface, where it might take the escort under fire with its deck gun. This division of labor, close-in escort groups protecting the convoy, support groups hunting aggressively, represented a conceptual breakthrough. It addressed the fundamental tension between the duty to protect and the opportunity to attack. Yet support groups remained scarce through 1940 and 1941, and their deployment was sporadic. The deeper tension lay within the Admiralty itself, between competing visions of how to prosecute the naval war. The Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, the senior operational commander of the Royal Navy, believed that the primary threat came from German surface units, capital ships, cruisers, and eventually invasion craft. Resources devoted to convoy escort, he argued, were resources removed from the battle fleet's strength. Every destroyer assigned to shepherd merchant ships was a destroyer unavailable for the great fleet engagement that naval doctrine suggested would decide the war. Against this view stood a smaller group of Admiralty officials and operational commanders who understood that merchant shipping was already dying at rates that might, if unchecked, render Britain unable to fight. The Chief of the Naval Staff and his immediate subordinates grasped the mathematics of the tonnage war. Every ship sunk meant food denied, weapons delayed, oil reserves depleted. If merchant losses exceeded new construction, Britain would literally starve and militarily atrophy. This second group pushed relentlessly for more escorts, more support groups, and the wholesale reallocation of naval resources toward protecting the Atlantic convoys. This debate was not conducted in abstract terms. It was fought over the specific allocation of each ship class, every destroyer flotilla, the distribution of naval construction capacity between warship and merchant vessel programs. Every decision favored one side of this argument and implicitly disadvantaged the other. The bitter irony was that both sides were correct in their premises, but incomplete in their understanding. The traditionalists were right that naval resources were finite, that every corvette devoted to convoy work was unavailable for other duties, that some degree of concentration was necessary for the battle fleet. But they had catastrophically underestimated the degree to which merchant shipping had become the true center of gravity of the war. The progressives were right that the U-boat threat to merchant shipping was existential, and that it demanded resources commensurate with that threat. But they consistently overestimated how quickly new escorts could be trained and how effective they would be once deployed. The learning curve was steep, and experience accumulated slowly. A newly commissioned corvette, fresh from the builder's yard, would take months before its crew developed the cohesion and expertise to effectively hunt submarines. An officer newly assigned to escort command would require weeks of observation before his captaincy was genuinely competent. These learning periods came at the cost of merchant ships already sent to the bottom. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, convoy losses mounted steadily, and the Admiralty's escort resources remained stretched dangerously thin. What saved the convoy system during this period was not the adequacy of escort forces, but rather the incompleteness of the wolf pack system itself. Dönitz's tactical innovation was powerful, but it depended absolutely on the coordination that radio communication provided. U-boats had to surface or rise to periscope depth to transmit their contact reports to shore headquarters. They had to receive their orders from BDU, their bearings and approach vectors, calculated by commanders ashore. The longer U-boats remained in contact with a convoy, broadcasting messages and receiving instructions, the more vulnerable they became to detection by the HF/DF sets aboard the escorts. Early Wolfpack operations were still sporadic and opportunistic. Dönitz was building his doctrine, experimenting with his tactics, and the convoy system, primitive as it was, remained intact. The escorts of 1940 and 1941 were learning how to kill U-boats. Not yet efficiently, not yet systematically, but learning nonetheless. Men like Captain Frederick John Walker, who would emerge as perhaps the finest anti-submarine tactician the British produced, were beginning their operational education. Walker's later fame rested on a simple conviction. Every U-boat in contact with a convoy would be hunted without mercy, without respite, until it was either destroyed or driven away to recover. This philosophy, which seemed obvious in retrospect, was genuinely revolutionary when expressed and practiced in 1940. It represented a categorical rejection of the passive defense mentality and an embrace of aggressive counterattack as the fundamental principle of escort operations. The gradual professionalization of the escorts created the preconditions for survival when the Wolfpack campaign intensified in 1942 and 1943. The escort groups that had been learning their trade through 1940 and 1941 had accumulated knowledge in their bones. Their captains understood one another's likely actions. Their operators could read their instruments with expertise born of repetition. Their crews had achieved the coordination and trust that only experience provides. When Dönitz unleashed his coordinated Wolfpack attacks in earnest, these escort groups possessed something invaluable. Not the numbers they needed, not the technology they would eventually require, but the tactical sophistication and aggressive spirit to inflict damage on the U-boats when opportunity arose. The debates within the Admiralty over resource allocation would continue, and would not be fully resolved until the crisis of 1943 forced the hand of even the most conservative naval traditionalists. But by the end of 1941, the Royal Navy and its Canadian partners had begun the transformation from reluctant convoy guardians to hunters of submarines. The men who staffed the bridge watches, the sonar compartments, and the depth charge crews of 1,000 escort vessels had stopped thinking of themselves as junior partners in the naval war and had begun to embrace their role as the frontline defenders of Britain's survival. That shift in mentality, born from hard-won experience, and sometimes from the bitter knowledge of convoys lost, would prove as important as any technology in the battles to come. Chapter 8, America Wakes. Through the first 2 years of the European War, the United States maintained a posture that was legally neutral, while emotionally and increasingly materially committed to Britain's survival. The Neutrality Acts, passed in the late 1930s, as a response to American disillusionment with the First World War, had been designed to prevent the nation from being drawn into foreign conflicts through trade and credit entanglement. Yet, as France fell and Britain stood alone in 1940, American public opinion shifted with remarkable speed. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that Britain's defeat would leave the United States facing a Nazi-dominated Europe and a militarized Japanese empire in the Pacific without meaningful opposition. The political challenge was to aid Britain without appearing to violate the neutrality legislation that still commanded substantial support in Congress and the country. Roosevelt's solution was characteristically oblique and ingenious. Instead of war loans that would be repudiated after the conflict ended, as had happened after the First World War, the United States would supply Britain with weapons, ships, and supplies on a basis that Roosevelt called Lend-Lease. The actual legislative framework was remarkably simple. The president would be authorized to manufacture or procure defense articles and transfer them to any nation deemed vital to American security, with repayment to be determined later and primarily through goods and services rather than currency. When Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, the United States had crossed a threshold that would prove irreversible, though few in Congress or the administration fully grasped how quickly the nation would move from peaceful supply to armed belligerence. The Atlantic Ocean became the stage for an undeclared war between American and German naval forces, long before the formal declaration of war in December of 1941. American destroyers and Coast Guard cutters, ostensibly engaged in neutrality patrols to report on foreign warships operating in the Western Hemisphere, began escorting British convoys across the Atlantic, with increasing openly. In May of 1941, the USS Greer, an American destroyer, was attacked by the German U-boat U-494 in what became known as the Greer Incident. The boat had been shadowing a British convoy when the destroyer attempted to establish its position, and after a series of escalating warnings, the German captain fired 2 torpedoes. Neither found their mark, but the symbolic significance was explosive. Roosevelt seized upon the incident to denounce German aggression and declared that henceforth American vessels would fire upon any Axis warship encountered in the waters the United States deemed necessary to its defense. The official American position remained that the nation was not at war, yet American warships were now engaged in what amounted to open naval combat. In October, the USS Kearney was damaged by a U-boat torpedo with loss of life, and shortly thereafter, the USS Reuben James became the first American naval vessel actually sunk by German action. Congress was forced to repeal key provisions of the Neutrality Acts, and by November of 1941, the fiction of neutrality had become so transparent that it was merely a formality awaiting ceremonial dissolution. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December provided that ceremony, and with it came an entirely new strategic environment for the submarine war in the Atlantic. The Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor accomplished something that all of Dönitz's success in the Atlantic had not. It drew the United States into the war, not as an increasingly involved third party, but as a fully committed belligerent, with all the military, industrial, and political consequences that status entailed. For the Germans, the initial American entry into the war presented an unexpected opportunity. The United States Navy was reeling from the losses at Pearl Harbor and facing an enormous war in the Pacific. The defense of the Atlantic had been thinned by the diversion of destroyers and other escort vessels to replace those lost in Hawaii. More critically, the American coastal defense system was in a state of shock and near-complete unpreparedness. Cities along the eastern seaboard continued operating with full peacetime lighting into the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942. Streetlights burned, neon signs illuminated in commercial districts, and window lights blazed in residential areas. Merchant ships sailed singly, maintaining peacetime routing and speed patterns. Harbor installations operated under conditions of security that were laughably inadequate for wartime. Dönitz immediately grasped the opportunity. In January of 1942, he dispatched a small flotilla of U-boats to the American eastern coast to begin what would become known as Operation Drumbeat in German records, and what American submarine historians would later call the Second Happy Time. The American eastern seaboard was about to become a killing ground. The first weeks of Operation Drumbeat produced results that astonished even Dönitz and his commanders. The German U-boats found themselves in circumstances that seemed almost incomprehensible after nearly 3 years of operating in the heavily defended waters of the Atlantic. Merchant ships were silhouetted against the lights of cities just miles inland. American cargo vessels moved in predictable patterns along well-known coastal routes. There were virtually no escort forces to oppose them. Some U-boat captains reported being able to surface, approach targets in broad daylight, and attack without significant risk of interception. The sinkings accumulated with horrible speed. In January and February of 1942, German submarines sent more than 100,000 tons of shipping to the bottom along the American coast. The losses included tanker ships carrying irreplaceable oil imports, cargo vessels laden with supplies destined for Britain and for the preparation of American forces, and warships that had been engaged in coastal convoy escort. American newspaper headlines screamed with shock and bewilderment. Citizens in coastal cities reported seeing burning ships on the horizon at night. Bodies and wreckage washed ashore on American beaches. The initial American response was chaos. Some coastal communities announced curfews. Others demanded that the Navy do something, though what, precisely, remained unclear to policymakers who had never trained for such circumstances. Coastal blackout orders were issued piecemeal and enforced unevenly. The fundamental assumption underlying American civil defense, that the continental United States was invulnerable, shattered within weeks. The human cost of the second happy time was staggering. Merchant sailors, many of them regular employees of American shipping companies rather than Navy personnel, found themselves in circumstances of extraordinary danger, with minimal protection and preparation. Ships were sunk at night without warning, or in daytime attacks that left survivors struggling in cold water with limited rescue resources. Many sailors were lost, not to the initial explosion or gunfire, but to exposure in the Atlantic winter. A torpedoed tanker would spill its cargo of oil across the water, and survivors would be coated in burning fuel. Others clung to wreckage in water temperatures that allowed survival measured in minutes rather than hours. The American merchant marine, which would eventually suffer more casualties as a percentage of personnel engaged than any other American military service except the Marine Corps, was being blooded in the most brutal fashion imaginable. For many American sailors, the war suddenly became not a distant conflict, but an immediate and lethal reality occurring in their home waters, visible from the coast, a presence that could not be ignored or relegated to abstract discussion. The psychological impact on the American population was equally profound. The nation had been at war for only a few weeks. The Pacific Campaign was already proving catastrophic. Now the home front itself appeared threatened. There was a distinct possibility that German submarines might actually land agents on the American coast, or attempt raids on coastal installations, or sustain an indefinite campaign of merchant commerce destruction that would cripple the American economy. The immediate American response to this threat was a mixture of improvisation, learning, and the gradual mobilization of industrial resources that were, in fact, far more substantial than the Germans realized. The first weeks saw a desperate scarcity of escort vessels, Coast Guard cutters, naval subchasers, and whatever other warships could be spared were pressed into anti-submarine service, with crews that had minimal training in the tactics required. The Navy hastily converted fishing vessels, yachts, and other small craft into submarine hunters. Some were fitted with depth charges or other anti-submarine weapons. Others were given only machine guns and the expectation that their crews would drive U-boats to deeper water through sheer aggressive presence. American air forces along the coast were mobilized and began flying patrols, though the number of aircraft available was never adequate to cover the coastal regions completely. American shipbuilding yards, which under the Lend-Lease program had been gearing up to produce replacement vessels for British losses, now accelerated production for direct American use. Convoy systems, which the Navy had resisted implementing as economically inefficient before the war, were rapidly established. Initially, they were poorly organized and sometimes proved more dangerous to the ships within them than independent sailing. But within weeks and months, the convoy escort formations began to develop the sort of discipline and tactical competence that the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy had spent 3 years achieving. American commanders began to grasp the fundamental principles that convoy escorts had learned through hard experience in the Atlantic. Aggressive counterattack against detected U-boats. Refuse to break off even if the attack seemed to be intensifying. Use every available weapon to force the submarine to submerge and break contact. The German advantage, however, proved to be extraordinarily temporary. Dönitz had anticipated that the American eastern seaboard would provide a hunting ground for perhaps 2 or 3 months before American defenses achieved sufficient organization to make operations prohibitively costly. In fact, the American learning curve proved even steeper than such expectations suggested. By March of 1942, only 2 months after Operation Drumbeat had begun, U-boat losses began to rise. The sinking rate of merchant vessels declined measurably. By April and May, the campaign along the American coast had become sufficiently hazardous that Dönitz was forced to gradually withdraw his boats from the coastal waters and redeploy them back to the mid-Atlantic, where the convoy battles with British and Canadian escorts continued. The total tonnage sunk during this second happy time was substantial, approaching 650,000 tons in the first half of 1942 along the American coast. But the losses were achieved at an operational cost that proved unsustainable. The average tonnage sunk per U-boat, per patrol in American coastal waters, was higher than anywhere else in the campaign, approaching figures that would never be matched again. Yet even these extraordinary returns could not offset the simple arithmetic that American industrial production was coming online at a rate that made replacement of losses increasingly irrelevant. The Liberty ship program was entering full production. The American shipbuilding industry was producing faster tonnage replacement than German submarines could achieve sinkings. The moment of maximum opportunity for the U-boats, the window when American defenses were unprepared and industrial mobilization still ramping up, was closing with remarkable speed. The strategic implications of this rapid closure were only partially understood by German high command at the time. The second happy time, along the American coast, had seemed to confirm Dönitz's thesis that coordinated submarine warfare could indeed strangle an island nation dependent on maritime commerce. The United States, if it could be subjected to similar attrition rates, might be forced to divert resources from the Pacific and from support for Britain to merely defending its own coastal shipping. The cumulative losses of shipping in early 1942, added to the continuing attrition being inflicted on British convoys in the Atlantic, suggested that the tonnage losses might actually exceed the combined Allied replacement capacity. Yet this calculation failed to account for a fundamental transformation that had already occurred. The arrival of American industrial power into the Allied coalition meant that the material ratio of the war had shifted decisively. The United States could not only replace losses, but could expand total cargo capacity simultaneously, while supplying its own military expansion. American shipbuilding capacity was growing, even as the U-boat arm faced the prospect of actually declining operational strength. The boats sunk in American coastal waters in those heady months of early 1942 included experienced commanders and trained crews that would be impossible to replace. As Germany's own losses mounted, Dönitz could not anticipate this trajectory from the perspective of his headquarters in the winter of 1942. He could only observe the immediate success of his tactical concept and the eventual necessity of adapting to American defensive competence that proved far more rapid than his pre-war calculations had suggested. The second happy time also established a grim precedent for the character of the Atlantic campaign going forward. The U-boats had demonstrated conclusively that they could inflict fearsome damage on merchant shipping when defended coordination was absent and industrial mobilization remained incomplete. The problem for Germany was that both these conditions would, from this point forward, only move in the direction opposite to German advantage. Allied air cover would expand. Allied escort forces would become increasingly professional and numerous. Allied shipbuilding capacity would grow. German U-boat construction, while remarkable in its own right, would not be sufficient to match both the losses being inflicted and the replacement capacity being brought online. The strategic center of gravity had already begun to shift, though from the perspective of frontline German commanders and crews in the spring of 1942, the future remained uncertain. The experience of American sailors in those early months would shape the attitude of the United States toward merchant protection and convoy systems for the remainder of the war. The initial shock of finding the home waters dangerous, of discovering that the nation's vast industrial capacity could not instantaneously defend the coasts, would drive American priorities and resource allocation decisions that had enormous ripple effects across the Atlantic campaign. The second happy time appeared to be a German triumph. In fact, it was a warning bell that the United States, far from being a nation that could be bled by commerce destruction, was a nation that would, once fully aroused, prove capable of industrial mobilization that would eventually overwhelm any submarine fleet the Germans could sustain. In the vast emptiness of the North Atlantic, somewhere between the coast of Newfoundland and the waters south of Iceland, there existed a stretch of ocean that no aircraft could reach. It measured roughly 600 miles across. Not a fixed boundary, but a fluid calculation that shifted with the seasons, the range of available machines, and the desperate decisions made in Air Ministry offices thousands of miles away. This was the Black Pit. This was where the tonnage war was truly decided. For the convoys that passed through this zone, there was no possibility of air cover, no distant speck on the horizon that might drive a U-boat beneath the surface before it could launch its attack. There was only the guns of the escort vessels, the depth charges of the destroyers and corvettes, and the prayers of the merchant sailors, who understood, with absolute clarity, that they were crossing a line where the protective umbrella of Allied air power simply ended. The reason for this gap was partly geography and partly machinery. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft, operating from bases in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Newfoundland, could extend protection eastward into the Atlantic for several hundred miles. Similarly, German patrol planes and reconnaissance aircraft operating from the occupied coast of France and Norway could shield the waters closer to European shores. But the distance was simply too great. A four-engined patrol bomber could loiter only so long before fuel consumption dictated the return to base. Even the most advanced aircraft of the period, the consolidated PBY Catalina, the Lockheed Hudson, the Short Sunderland, faced physics that no amount of pilot skill or courage could overcome. The mathematics of fuel consumption and distance created an irreducible zone of vulnerability. By 1942, that gap had become the hunting ground, where Dönitz concentrated his wolf packs with ruthless precision. He understood his own vulnerability to air attack far better than many of his superiors. A U-boat forced to submerge could no longer shadow a convoy, could not maneuver into attack position, could not coordinate with sister boats across the darkness. Air power was the one weapon that made the Wolfpack tactic untenable. What made aircraft so devastatingly effective against submarines was not merely their existence, but the psychological and tactical transformation they imposed on submarine operations. A U-boat on the surface was a stable gun platform, capable of high speed, capable of maintaining contact with a fleeing convoy, capable of coordinating attacks across vast distances. A U-boat forced beneath the waves was something else entirely. Slow, nearly blind, unable to communicate by radio without rising to periscope depth and exposing itself to detection. The appearance of an aircraft on the horizon did not necessarily mean that the aircraft would attack or even that it had seen the submarine, but the possibility was enough to disrupt the entire operational calculus of a Wolfpack assault. A U-boat commander who had spent hours carefully maneuvering into position, who had signaled his location to BDU and waited for other boats to converge, would find himself forced to choose between staying on the surface and risking an air attack, or submerging and losing tactical advantage. More often than not, the choice was made for him by the sudden roar of engines overhead and the distinctive silhouette of a patrol aircraft turning toward him. The strategic importance of closing this air gap was understood by the British Admiralty almost from the start of the war, and it was understood equally clearly by the American naval leadership after December 1941. What was not understood, or at least not accepted, was where the resources should come from. Long-range patrol aircraft were specialized machines, expensive and difficult to build, and they were wanted by almost every theater command in the war. The Royal Air Force wanted them for reconnaissance over Germany. The Army wanted them for tactical support. The American Army Air Forces wanted them for operations in the Pacific. The Royal Canadian Air Force wanted them for patrols over Canadian home waters. Every commander could justify his claim with operational necessity. Every commander could point to lives that might be saved, objectives that might be achieved with a few more aircraft. The Admiralty's request for additional patrol aircraft seemed, to many officers trained in land-based thinking, to be asking for an enormous expenditure of resources for what was essentially a defensive operation. The bombers were supposed to go to Bomber Command, which was engaged in the Great Strategic Bombing Offensive against German industry. That was where the truly significant impact on the war might be achieved. Coastal Command, the Royal Air Force organization responsible for maritime patrol and convoy protection, found itself perpetually under-resourced and undervalued within its own service. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was the crucial aircraft in this debate. It was a heavy bomber, converted from American strategic bombing designs to carry maritime patrol equipment and extended-range fuel tanks. It could fly roughly twice as far as the aircraft currently available to Coastal Command. With a Liberator, it would be possible to cover the Atlantic Gap. Without enough Liberators, the gap would remain, and the U-boats would continue to hunt in near invulnerability. The problem was that the Liberators were also the aircraft most desperately needed for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The American 8th Air Force, building up strength in England for a sustained bombing offensive, wanted every Liberator available for that mission. The discussions over aircraft allocation became bitter, sometimes personal, and were never fully resolved until the crisis of early 1943 made the choice unavoidable by sheer weight of merchant losses. Dönitz, operating without access to these inter-service debates, but with a commander's intuitive understanding of the strategic environment, made his calculations accordingly. He was not unaware of the threat posed by aircraft. He had lost U-boats to air attack. He understood that the arrival of more long-range aircraft would degrade the operational environment for his boats. But in 1942 and the first months of 1943, the gap was still there. It was still wide enough. The Wolfpack still had sufficient operating room to maneuver, to attack, to sink merchant ships at rates that seemed catastrophic to the Allies. And to Dönitz, proof that the strategy was fundamentally sound. The solution, in his estimation, was not to withdraw, but to push harder, to concentrate more boats in the gap, to accept the casualties that air attacks would inflict as simply another cost of operations. The very existence of the air gap shaped his operational planning. He knew roughly where the aircraft coverage ended. He knew where the convoys were vulnerable. He positioned his boats accordingly, holding them on station in the Black Pit, waiting for targets that the geography of the Atlantic had delivered almost directly into his hands. The actual experience of flying a maritime patrol mission in this period was grueling in ways that strategic calculations in Air Ministry offices could not quite capture. A pilot and his crew would take off from a base in Northern Ireland or Iceland, carrying enough fuel for a mission that might last 14 or 16 hours, knowing that every hour of that flight was an hour away from home, with dwindling reserves for the return. They were not fighting a concentrated enemy with established positions. They were searching an ocean that was, for practical purposes, infinite. A U-boat on the surface was a relatively small target. Spotting one required luck as much as skill. Finding one required being in the right place at the right time. The crews maintained their vigilance, their discipline, knowing that the merchant ships whose lives depended on them carried grain, oil, ammunition, and the sinews of war. But most of them knew this in the abstract way that most of us know abstract statistics. The concreteness of the danger came when the radio crackled with distress signals, when they heard the reports of merchant ships sunk, when they returned to find gaps in the squadron of aircraft that had departed that same morning. When the aircraft did find a U-boat, when the contact report crackled back to base and the bombs or depth charges were released, the effect was often enough to disrupt the attack that was in progress or about to begin. A U-boat that crash-dived to evade an aircraft dive-bombing attack would take several minutes to descend to a safe depth. During those minutes, it was out of contact with the convoy and out of radio communication with other members of its pack. The shadowing boat that was supposed to maintain contact and broadcast homing signals would lose its prey. The convergence pattern that BDU had so carefully orchestrated from the headquarters in Paris would come apart. The convoy might limp away, bloodied perhaps, but alive. For the U-boat crews, who had grown accustomed to operating with nearly complete freedom during the night surface attacks on poorly escorted convoys, the arrival of aircraft represented a fundamental change in the conditions of combat. A weapon that had seemed almost invincible when deployed against isolated merchant ships and thinly stretched destroyer escorts suddenly became beatable when aircraft appeared on the scene. The campaign to acquire more liberators for Coastal Command became one of the most intense inter-service struggles of the British war effort in 1942. The arguments were almost theological in their intensity. On one side stood the advocates for the bombing offensive, men who believed, with genuine conviction, that the destruction of German industry would so weaken the enemy that the armies could simply walk through continental Europe without facing organized opposition. On the other side stood the naval officers and the commanders of Coastal Command, who pointed to the tonnage of shipping being sunk and argued that no strategic bombing campaign could compensate for the loss of the means to transport war materials to the places where they would be used. The debate was not settled by reason or by evidence. It was settled by events. When the losses in March 1943 reached unprecedented levels, when the Admiralty seriously contemplated the possible suspension of the convoy system, the allocation of aircraft suddenly became a matter of national survival, rather than a matter of inter-service priority. The liberators began to arrive in sufficient numbers. The gap began to narrow. The clock had already started ticking on the Wolfpack era, though no one at the time fully grasped how short the remaining time would prove to be. For the merchant crews and the escort forces, the Black Pit remained a zone of dread. Even as aircraft coverage was being slowly expanded eastward, even as the logistics of repositioning long-range aircraft to forward bases were being managed, the gap was still there. The convoys still had to cross it. The U-boats still hunted in it. The tension of approaching the gap's boundary on a westbound convoy was almost palpable. The knowledge that for the next several days there would be no air cover, no distant protective umbrella. The crews would maintain higher watches. The escort commanders would place their ships more aggressively. Everything would be done with the understanding that they were now entirely dependent on the surface escorts and the luck of not encountering a large pack. Many ships did not survive that crossing. Many men did not come home. The Black Pit was not merely a geographical feature or a technical problem to be solved through engineering and industrial production. It was a space where the outcome of the war was being shaped, day by day, by the intersection of distance, fuel consumption, courage, and the slowly tightening application of technology against an enemy that had nowhere else to go. The conversations happening in the headquarters of the Royal Air Force and in the American War Department in the spring of 1943 were ultimately conversations about where the Atlantic campaign stood in the hierarchy of the war's priorities. The resources required to close the air gap were substantial. They would not be available for other operations. They represented choices made, opportunities foregone, but the losses of merchant shipping were even more substantial. They were not merely numbers in an accounting ledger. They were ships that had been built in American yards, loaded with supplies in American ports, manned by crews from a dozen nations, and sent across an ocean where a machine smaller than a large house could sink them with a single volley of torpedoes. The decision to allocate the liberators, when it finally came, was a decision that the tonnage war had shifted from a problem that might be solved by naval tactics alone to a problem that required the integration of all the tools of modern warfare. Air power, once considered something of a luxury in the Atlantic campaign, suddenly became essential. The black pit would narrow. It would not close entirely. The geography and the fuel consumption of the aircraft guaranteed that. But it would narrow enough. It would narrow just enough for the tide to turn. And when it did, the U-boats would discover that the ocean that had seemed so vast and so invulnerable had suddenly become a trap. While the men of the Atlantic fought their battle on the surface and beneath the waves, another war was being waged in the shadows. A war fought not with depth charges and guns, but with mathematics, ingenuity, and stolen secrets. This was the intelligence campaign that would ultimately determine who held the advantage in the vast contest for control of the sea lanes. It was a battle where both sides possessed extraordinary capabilities to read the other's most closely guarded communications, a mirror maze of decryption and counter-decryption that transformed the Atlantic itself into a battlefield where invisible information flowed as surely as cordite and oil. The Enigma machine, that mechanical marvel of German engineering, sat at the center of this shadow war. To the German Navy, it represented the unbreakable foundation of their operational security, a cipher that rotated through millions of potential settings, a code that seemed mathematically impregnable. Yet from the earliest months of the war, British codebreakers understood that mathematical impenetrability and practical vulnerability were very different things. What mattered was not whether the code could theoretically be broken, but whether it could be broken fast enough to be useful. The answer to that question would shape the fate of convoys and the lives of thousands of men at sea. The story of breaking the naval enigma began not in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, but in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. In April of 1940, a German trawler named the Richard Bateson was captured by the British minesweeper Sharpshooter, and among the documents recovered were the settings for the German naval Enigma machine for the month of June. It was a beginning, a single month's settings that opened a small window into German communications. But a single month's settings, no matter how valuable, could not sustain a long-term decrypt operation. The window would close when June became July, and the Germans would have no idea that their security had been compromised. What the British needed was not merely current settings, but a way to read the settings before they changed. They needed an ongoing source of keys, or they needed to break the enigma mathematically from the inside out. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park began work on both problems simultaneously. The mathematicians and linguists and chess champions assembled there understood the Enigma's architecture intimately, the way the rotors advanced, the mechanical logic that governed which electrical pathways would activate when a key was pressed. They built machines called bomb bays that could mechanically simulate Enigma operations and search for the correct rotor settings. But these machines, brilliant as they were, could only work effectively if they had a clear starting point. A piece of plain text they knew corresponded to a piece of ciphertext. This was called a crib. Without it, the search space remained impossibly vast. The second source of intelligence proved more immediately productive. The German Navy relied on weather ships, heavily armed trawlers positioned in the Atlantic that collected meteorological information and broadcast weather reports back to German naval headquarters. These weather ships were valuable targets, not only for the intelligence they provided about conditions at sea, but for the Enigma materials they carried. In May of 1941, the British minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter captured the weather ship Lauenburg, and with it came the Enigma settings and the bigram tables, the substitution tables that were crucial to setting the machine correctly each day. 2 months later, in July of 1941, a second weather ship, the München, was captured, and again the British obtained the Enigma keys. These captures were not accidental discoveries, but the result of a deliberate intelligence campaign to target German vessels known to carry the materials required to read their communications. For the British, each capture was a small miracle, a gift that extended their window of visibility into German operations. For the Germans, the losses of these vessels went largely unnoticed at the time. They assumed their machines were secure. They had no indication that the Enigma, that supposedly impregnable cipher, was being read by their enemies. By the spring of 1942, the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had established a working capability to read naval Enigma traffic, though not in real time. There was a lag of many hours, sometimes days, between the moment a U-boat received an order from Dönitz's headquarters and the moment the British codebreakers could read that order. Nevertheless, the intelligence was extraordinarily valuable. It allowed the Admiralty to understand the distribution and movement of German submarines across the Atlantic. It allowed them to route convoys along paths that avoided known wolfpack positions. It allowed them to understand Dönitz's operational thinking, his strategic priorities, and the state of his forces. The effect was not always immediately visible. A convoy that arrived safely at its destination without seeing a U-boat might owe its safety to an intelligence decision made in a quiet room at Bletchley Park, a decision that the sailors aboard the merchant ships would never know had saved their lives. The Admiralty called this process convoy routing, and it became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The operations officers who received the decrypted intelligence knew it came from Enigma breaks, but the convoy commodores at sea were given only the routing instructions, never the reason why they were being sent on a particular course. To maintain operational security, to prevent any possibility that the British ability to read German signals might be compromised, the source of the intelligence had to be hidden as completely as if the intelligence did not exist at all. But the Atlantic War was not a conflict in which one side possessed total information advantage. The Germans were themselves reading British communications, and with considerable success. The German Navy employed its own cipher machines and conducted its own signals intelligence operations, and during 1942 and into the middle of 1943, German codebreakers achieved a breakthrough in reading British naval convoy routing signals. These were the signals that told merchant ships when to form convoys, which route to take, which escorts would protect them, and where they were headed. For the British, these were the most sensitive signals of all, information that had to be communicated to hundreds of ships across the Atlantic, yet information that could not be protected as fully as a military cipher because of the sheer volume of ships that needed to receive it. The result was that German U-boat commanders, receiving intercepts passed along from their headquarters, sometimes knew the composition and intended route of a convoy before the British naval commanders, actually directing the convoy operations, realized the German advantage. This was the most dangerous period of the entire campaign, the moment when both sides were reading each other's mail. The Germans knew where the convoys were going. The British knew where the U-boats were positioned, and yet neither side could act on this knowledge too obviously, because doing so would reveal that their own communications had been compromised. It was a ghastly game, played across thousands of miles of ocean, with the lives of merchant sailors the stakes. The Germans changed their Enigma settings on the 1st of February 1942, adding a fourth rotor to the naval Enigma machine. This was a catastrophic event from the British perspective. The extra rotor vastly increased the number of possible settings, and suddenly the British codebreakers found themselves shut out. The intelligence flow stopped. The window they had so carefully opened closed completely. For 10 months, 10 months of uninterrupted U-boat offensive operations, the British would not be able to read German naval Enigma traffic. This period coincided almost exactly with the second happy time off the American coast, and the time of the heaviest merchant losses of the entire Atlantic campaign. It was no accident that German U-boats achieved their greatest successes in American waters precisely when British codebreakers were blind to their movements. The Americans, new to naval warfare and without the infrastructure that Britain had developed for signals intelligence, were unable to help. The only way the British could read German signals during this period was to continue to seek physical captures of Enigma materials, the weather ships, and other vessels that carried the keys. In June of 1942, the British captured the German weather ship Elbe and obtained the Enigma keys. This gave them a small window into German operations during a single month, but it was not enough. They needed more captures, and they needed them continuously. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In the summer of 1942, the British learned that a German U-boat, the U-305, had captured a British minesweeper called the Sharpshooter, the very same sharpshooter that had been capturing German weather ships. Inside the U-boat were papers and documents that might, if examined carefully, reveal something about German naval operations. The Admiralty faced a terrible dilemma. If they attempted to recover the U-boat before it could dive and escape, they might capture it and recover the documents it held. But attempting to recover it would alert the Germans to the fact that the British cared deeply about these papers, which would be a confession that the British were reading German communications. The decision was made to leave the U-boat to escape. The documents were lost, but the intelligence officers at Bletchley Park learned something from examining what material they could recover. The Germans were using weather ships as an ongoing source of Enigma keys, just as the British were attempting to do. In December of 1942, the British captured the weather ship Lauenburg again, the same ship that had been captured earlier in the war and had escaped, and was now recaptured in the same position, performing the same function. With the settings from the Lauenburg and other captured vessels, the British managed to achieve a breakthrough in April of 1943, finally breaking back into the four-rotor naval Enigma. It had taken 10 months. 10 months in which the only advantage the British could claim was that they understood the geography of the Atlantic and could make educated guesses about where U-boats were likely to be. 10 months in which convoy losses mounted and the tonnage sank, reached catastrophic levels. But in April, the lights came back on. The British codebreakers, assisted by American cryptanalysts who had been working on the problem in parallel, managed to read the four-rotor Enigma. The intelligence flow resumed. The British could once again see where the U-boats were positioned. What happened next revealed the true power of signals intelligence in modern warfare. With the enigma broken once more, the Admiralty began receiving a stream of information about U-boat positions, movement orders, and tactical intentions. This intelligence was passed immediately to the convoy routing authorities and the escort commanders at sea. Convoys could be routed around known wolfpack positions. Hunter-killer groups could be positioned ahead of German submarines. The U-boats, unaware that their supposedly secure communications were being read, continued to broadcast their positions, their intentions, and their requests for fuel and supplies. Every message they sent provided the British with more information about where they were. And yet the Germans, reading British convoy routing signals in return, wondered why their wolf packs so frequently arrived at positions only to find the convoys gone. They developed theories about spies in their midst, about leaks in German headquarters, about careless radio discipline among their own personnel. Some U-boat captains suspected that the British were reading their signals, but their concerns were dismissed by the German Naval High Command. The enigma could not be broken. This was accepted as gospel among German officers. Therefore, if the convoys were disappearing, the explanation must lie elsewhere. This conviction that the enigma was unbreakable would remain fixed in German minds for the remainder of the war. The intelligence officers at Bletchley Park, however, understood a critical vulnerability in the German position. The very volume of signals traffic that made the Wolfpack system possible was the same volume of traffic that provided Allied codebreakers with material to work with. Every radio message that Dönitz sent to coordinate a pack attack, every situation report that a U-boat captain transmitted to headquarters, every response from shore stations, each of these messages was encrypted on the Enigma, and each one provided a data point that mathematicians could use to narrow the possible rotor settings. The more U-boats operating on the surface at night, attacking convoys and reporting their successes, the more messages there were to intercept and break. The very tactical system that Dönitz had designed to overwhelm the British convoy system through coordinated attack was generating the signals traffic that made it possible for British codebreakers to read his intentions. This was not a disadvantage that Dönitz could easily correct. The Wolfpack system required communication, and communication required radio transmissions. Silence would mean loss of control, and loss of control would mean the Wolfpacks would scatter and lose their effectiveness. Dönitz chose to accept the risk of being read in order to maintain the coordination that made the system work. It was a wager, and he lost it. By the late spring and summer of 1943, as the American shipbuilding program was producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and as new escort vessels and escort carriers were coming into service, the intelligence advantage conferred by reading the naval enigma became decisive. The Admiralty could position escort forces not merely to protect convoys, but to actively hunt U-boats. Support groups could be sent to areas where Enigma decrypts indicated U-boats were gathering. Hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers could intercept U-boats in transit based on intelligence. The U-boat arm, which had relied on its ability to concentrate force and achieve surprise, now found that its concentrations were known in advance and that surprises were impossible. The Wolfpack system that had brought the British nation to the edge of starvation in 1942 and early 1943 became increasingly difficult to execute when the Wolfpacks could not achieve surprise, and the more U-boats were lost to these intelligence-informed operations, the fewer boats were available to replace them. The Germans increased their investment in new submarine construction and began accelerating the production of advanced boats like the Type 21, but these boats would not be ready for service until late 1944 at the earliest. In the meantime, the U-boat arm was bleeding experienced crews and commanders at a rate that could not be sustained. The intelligence war had turned decisively in the Allies' favor, and the tactical war on the Atlantic would be decided as a consequence. Yet even as the Admiralty was reading German signals, it faced a terrifying vulnerability of its own. The German Navy, through its own signals intelligence operations, had broken the British naval cipher used for convoy routing throughout 1942 and into the middle of 1943. This cipher was not as complex or mechanically sophisticated as the Enigma. It relied more on substitution and transposition, and the Germans had been able to attack it mathematically with considerable success. The result was that U-boat captains sometimes received warning of convoy movements before the convoy itself did, or at least before the convoy's commanding officer realized he was being tracked. The Admiralty eventually discovered this vulnerability. In the late winter of 1943, as spring crept across the North Atlantic with still bitter winds and towering grey seas, the German submarine force reached the apex of its power. Karl Dönitz had refined his wolfpack tactics into something approaching a science of coordinated destruction. His headquarters at Naval, in occupied France, possessed the intelligence, the communications capability, and the tactical doctrine to orchestrate the movements of dozens of submarines across thousands of miles of ocean. The U-boat arm had never been stronger in numbers. More than 100 operational boats now ranged the Atlantic on any given week. Yet March 1943 would reveal that strength was an illusion, built upon a single, unseen pillar. When that pillar cracked, everything balanced upon it would fall. The first blow fell on the convoy designated HX-228 in the second week of March. This was a standard eastbound convoy bound from New York to Liverpool, carrying raw materials, ammunition, and the essential supplies upon which Britain's survival depended. The column of ships stretched across the horizon in the standard array, columns of 4 vessels abreast, separated by carefully calculated intervals, protected by a thin screen of escort vessels. The escort group was not insignificant by contemporary standards. 7 ships commanded by a senior escort commander. Yet it was precisely this moment, this place, and this balance of force that the Wolfpack had been assembled to exploit. 20 U-boats had been positioned across the convoy's anticipated route, waiting in the mid-Atlantic gap where no aircraft could reach them, where Dönitz's shore-based intelligence had calculated the merchant ships must pass. The shadowing began on the 11th of March, when the lead U-boat made contact with the convoy's starboard flank. The boat maintained careful distance, transmitting regular position signals to Naval by high-frequency radio. Other boats in the pack homed toward those signals as though following an invisible thread, converging from across the darkness. The escort commander knew that his small group faced something approaching overwhelming odds. Yet the textbook response remained unchanged. Aggressively hunt each U-boat, attempt to drive it under and break contact, maintain course and speed for the convoy. It was the doctrine that the Royal Navy had fought to establish after painful earlier losses, and it remained sound. What made March 1943 different was not the doctrine, but the ruthless persistence and tactical coordination with which it was tested. The first attack came in darkness, in that marginal space between the setting sun and the moon's rise, when visibility was worst, and surface vessels became visible silhouettes to torpedoes. Multiple U-boats struck simultaneously from different bearings, the coordinated hammer blow that Dönitz had imagined in the 1930s, now executing with deadly precision. Ships exploded in the convoy's ranks. The scattered silence of the Atlantic night fractured into chaos. The roar of detonations, the terrible screams of men dying in cold water, the grinding wreckage of vessels breaking apart under the impact of warheads designed precisely to split their hulls. The escorts wheeled toward the origin points of the attacks, firing star shells to illuminate the darkness, launching depth charges at the fleeing U-boats. Some of the submarines dove and escaped, forced deep by the pressure waves and concussive force of explosives detonating around them. Others merely slipped sideways into the darkness and surfaced again miles away, resuming their stalking approach from a different angle. For 4 days, the battle continued with almost no respite. The escort crews had not slept more than minutes at a time in 96 hours. Men worked at the controls of their depth charge projectors and anti-submarine weapons, with the blank stare of absolute exhaustion, their judgment slowly eroding beneath the accumulating weight of continuous action. The U-boat crews, by contrast, could rest in shifts, could draw some recovery, even amid danger. The asymmetry was not lost on the British and Canadian sailors directing the fight. The convoy lost 13 ships, approximately 90,000 tons of irreplaceable cargo and shipping capacity, sent to the bottom in 4 days by fewer than a dozen U-boats that had accepted no losses whatsoever. HX-228 staggered on toward Liverpool, diminished and traumatized, carrying the shock of defeat. Before the survivors of HX-228 could reach safety, a second convoy met a similar fate. SC-122, a slow convoy climbing northeastward from Sydney, Nova Scotia, was surrounded by a second wolf pack that descended upon it with the same calculated savagery. 12 ships sank in rapid succession. The convoy's escorts, numbering only 5 vessels, were hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Their weapons could sink U-boats. A few were lost, but not fast enough to prevent the pack from maintaining its relentless assault. The losses mounted. 21,000 tons in one night, another 9,000 tons the following dawn. The pattern repeated. The escorts fought with courage that bordered on the suicidal, but courage alone could not overcome the mathematical reality of insufficient numbers distributed across an impossibly vast ocean. By the 3rd week of March, the cumulative weight of the simultaneous attacks against multiple convoys had created something approaching panic within the Allied naval establishment. The Admiralty in London, which had fought and bled and held the convoy system together through 4 years of war, now faced a question that no one had dared articulate before. Could the system itself hold? The losses were accelerating beyond any sustainable rate. The U-boats were sinking ships faster than American shipyards could replace them. More than 100,000 tons of merchant shipping had been sent to the bottom in a single month, the majority of those losses occurring in the Atlantic Gap, beyond the reach of air cover. Signals intelligence, which had provided the Admiralty with advance warning and the ability to route convoys around known U-boat concentrations, had suddenly gone silent. A change in the Enigma settings, the Germans switching to a new cipher on the 1st of February, had closed off the ability to read the submarine command network. The Admiralty's options appeared to be contracting toward catastrophe. If the convoys continued on their current routes in the Atlantic Gap, the U-boats would continue to massacre them at rates that no industrial economy could sustain. If the convoys were diverted around the gap, adding days to transit times and reducing cargo throughput at a moment when every ton of supply mattered, the cumulative effect might be equally destructive through attrition rather than violent sinking. The most radical option, discussed with genuine seriousness in the highest reaches of the Admiralty, was the temporary abandonment of the convoy system entirely in the Atlantic Gap, allowing ships to run independently, gambling that dispersal would reduce losses even as it increased the time required to move supplies. This idea, whispered in the halls of power in March 1943, would have represented an admission of absolute defeat. The entire defensive architecture that Britain had constructed would collapse, and with it, the ability to sustain military operations at their current intensity. The strain on the men executing the system was beyond simple description. Escort commanders were making decisions that sent merchant ships to the bottom. Routing choices, positioning decisions, the calculation of acceptable risk that meant some vessels would be sunk and their crews lost to the sea. Those decisions accumulated in the mind. Senior escort officers began to reach the limits of psychological endurance as they watched the ships under their protection sink in sight of the protective screen they had built around them. The men below decks in the convoy escorts, the stokers tending the furnaces, the deck crews on the merchant ships knowing that they carried cargoes that would make them targets, all existed in a state of existential tension that no amount of training could fully prepare them to endure. The weather in the North Atlantic in March was typically harsh, the seas towering, the air freezing, and all of this was now backdrop to an intensifying aerial campaign in which survival seemed increasingly random. The most alarming aspect of March 1943 was the sense that no countermeasure existed. The escort tactics that had proven effective in earlier months seemed suddenly ineffective against the scale of the Wolfpack assaults. The convoy system that had been proven effective across 4 years of war appeared to be reaching the limit of its utility. Even the best escort commanders, driving their ships and men to exhaustion, could not prevent the sinking of the ships they were meant to protect. The U-boats were not making tactical errors. They were not losing their nerve or their coordination. Instead, they were executing their tactical doctrine with a precision and persistence that suggested complete confidence. March 1943 was the moment at which the Wolfpack system achieved its full, terrible potential, and that achievement created the illusion that the system might be unstoppable. Yet that illusion was born from a dangerous blindness to the machinery being assembled against it. The technological solutions to the U-boat threat were not proceeding in isolation, awaiting some future happy moment of deployment. The centimetric radar that could detect surfaced submarines, regardless of darkness or weather, was being installed on escort vessels and fitted to maritime patrol aircraft. The ley light, an airborne searchlight of extraordinary power, had been developed and was beginning to arrive in the inventories of coastal command squadrons. The ahead-throwing Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, which fired patterns of projectiles ahead of the ship before a U-boat could evade, was entering service. Support groups, escort formations held in reserve to reinforce threatened convoys, were being organized and trained specifically for aggressive U-boat hunting. The Type 4 Huff Duff direction-finding equipment was spreading through the escort fleet, allowing commanders to locate transmitting U-boats by radio signal. And the allocation of very long-range Liberator bombers to Coastal Command, which had been delayed by inter-service arguments and the demands of other theaters, was finally approved, and aircraft were beginning to arrive. The crisis of March 1943 would endure for only another week before the combined pressure of sustained operations, poor weather, and the first arrivals of the new Allied equipment forced Dönitz to acknowledge the changing conditions. Yet in that single month, more than 100,000 tons of shipping, approximately 1,200,000 deadweight tons in merchant cargo and vessels, had been sent to the bottom. The Wolfpack system had achieved its maximum striking power in a very narrow window of time. The Admiralty had confronted the possibility of system failure and had not flinched. Instead, they had committed to holding the convoy system, resourcing the escort fleet with every available asset, and trusting that the technological pipeline would deliver the counters that they knew were coming. It was perhaps the most dangerous gamble of the entire Atlantic campaign, wagering the immediate present against promises about the near future. What neither the Admiralty nor Dönitz could have known in March 1943 was how rapidly the balance would tip once those promises began to be fulfilled. In the spring of 1943, The Atlantic's balance shifted with a speed that stunned both hunters and hunted. What had seemed impossible a year earlier, the reversal of the U-boat campaign's relentless momentum, was happening not because of any single breakthrough, but because multiple technical and organizational changes arrived at nearly the same moment, each one compounding the others into an effect far greater than the sum of its parts. These were not accidents of timing or strokes of miraculous fortune. They were the delayed harvest of decisions made under desperation in the darkest months of 1941 and early 1942, seeds planted when the Battle of the Atlantic seemed genuinely lost, decisions that had taken 18 to 24 months to bear fruit. By the time they did, the entire operational universe in which the U-boat arm had dominated had already begun to crack. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, was centimetric radar. For nearly 3 years, German submarines had operated on a hidden technological assumption. They could detect the presence of Allied radar using their own search receivers, tuned to the metric wavelengths on which early British air search radars operated. A U-boat operator, listening on his warning receiver, would hear the telltale pulse pattern and crash dive, sliding beneath the surface into what they believed was invisibility. But in 1942, the Allies had introduced radar operating on centimetric wavelengths so short that the existing German warning receivers could not detect them at all. A submarine might be running on the surface under starlight, the commander breathing the cool night air, the crew nursing cups of ersatz coffee in the control room, confident in their search receivers and their practiced vigilance, when an escort's centimetric radar beam would paint them perfectly, invisible to the U-boat's own electronic sensors. The boat would be spotted, attacked, perhaps sunk, and never know what had found it. The psychological effect of this unknown threat was as damaging as the physical one. U-boat commanders had built their tactics on the understanding that they could evade what they could detect. Centimetric radar shattered that assumption silently, invisibly, with a cold physics that their existing countermeasures could not touch. Paired with centimetric radar came the Lee Light, named after the officer who championed its development. This was a powerful searchlight, mounted in the nose of a maritime patrol aircraft, invisible until the moment it blazed on with the intensity of daylight, precisely at the moment when the aircraft's radar had brought the pilot directly above or beside a surfaced U-boat. The light, the roar of engines, and the sudden vulnerability it represented created moments of absolute terror in the conning towers of submarines. A boat attempting to dive would spend precious seconds getting under, seconds in which a depth-charged attack could be pressed home. Even if the boat escaped, the psychological wound went deep. The carefully cultivated invincibility of the wolf-pack hunter, the predator of the night, was exposed as a fiction. The darkness that had always been the U-boat's ally had become a trap, a stage upon which they could be illuminated and destroyed. The technological transformation extended to the weapons that escorts could deploy against submerged targets. The traditional depth charge remained the staple, but its patterns of deployment had been refined through brutal experience and mathematical analysis. Depth charges dropped in more carefully calculated patterns, at precisely calculated intervals, with improved settings that allowed for precise detonation at varying depths, created a much denser and more lethal pattern than the relatively haphazard attacks of earlier years. But beyond this refinement came an entirely new weapon system, the Hedgehog. This was an ahead-throwing mortar that fired 24 small explosive charges in a pattern that would straddle a detected submarine. Unlike depth charges, which created a massive explosion and pressure wave, even if they missed, Hedgehog charges detonated only on contact. This meant escorts could attack without the violent gyrations that made their own ASDIC contact unreliable. An escort could stay in effective contact and press a sustained attack, turning the submarine's submerged position from a refuge into a trap. The psychological advantage shifted in a single leap. A U-boat going deep to escape was no longer assured of safety. The escort could follow, could attack repeatedly, and each charge that detonated against the hull added to the horror of submersion. The expansion of the escort carrier program proved equally transformative. These were modest vessels, sometimes conversions of merchant hulls, sometimes built from the keel up as purpose-designed platforms. But they carried 4 or 5 anti-submarine aircraft, integral to each escort group. A U-boat could no longer rely on the mid-Atlantic air gap. Every convoy now traveled with its own aerial predators, aircraft that could launch at first light, could maintain stations overhead for hours, and could force any shadowing U-boat to submerge, breaking the vital radio contact that Dönitz's command system depended upon. The escort carrier program had been contentious, consuming resources that other commanders demanded, but by 1943, its value had become undeniable. A convoy with an organic escort carrier group had a fundamentally different defensive posture than one relying solely on surface escorts and the distant promise of shore-based air support. And that brings us to the closing of the air gap itself. Very long-range aircraft, the Liberator bombers, equipped with forward-firing rockets and precision depth bombs, with patrol endurance that stretched from distant air bases to cover the mid-Atlantic and back, had been shamefully scarce through 1942. The decision to allocate them to coastal command rather than to strategic bombing efforts had been contested bitterly, argued in headquarters, written about in memoranda that dripped with anxiety and frustration. But by the spring of 1943, the allocation had become decisive. The 600-mile gap in air coverage that had been the Wolf Pack sanctuary began to shrink. Patrols that had once meant certain safety became zones of peril. A U-boat could still operate there, but the assumption of impunity was gone. The boat was no longer free to hunt. It was hunted, watched, vulnerable to aircraft that appeared seemingly from nowhere. The critical insight is that these technologies did not arrive one by one, spaced across months or years, allowing the U-boat arm time to develop countermeasures or adjust tactics. They arrived in a dense cluster, a convergence of capabilities that combined to create an environment fundamentally hostile to the Wolfpack system. Centimetric radar removed the U-boat's electronic awareness on the surface. The Lee light eliminated the advantage of darkness. The Hedgehog made submersion itself less of a refuge. Escort carriers provided dedicated air cover that was harder to evade. Very long-range aircraft closed the gap where boats had felt safest. And all of these capabilities were being wielded by escort crews and pilots who had now accumulated 2 years of experience, who had learned through bitter repetition how to use their equipment, how to coordinate their attacks, how to fight to the exhaustion of their targets, rather than breaking off when a U-boat dove. The deeper explanation for this technological clustering lies in decisions made during the bleakest days of the campaign. In late 1941 and early 1942, when the U-boat arm seemed unstoppable, when the sinking rates exceeded replacement rates, and politicians spoke openly of potential defeat, an extraordinary mobilization of scientific and industrial effort had begun. Centimetric radar had been approved for priority production. The Lee light, still an experiment, had been given crash development status. The escort carrier program had been expanded dramatically. The Hedgehog had been moved from the drawing board toward operational deployment. These decisions had been made not in abstract planning offices, but in the teeth of immediate crisis, driven by the conviction that unless something changed, the war would be lost. The 18 months that followed were spent taking these ideas from the laboratory to the fleet, training crews, working out the integration of new systems with existing doctrine, building enough hulls and weapons and equipment to matter across the entire Atlantic theater. The result was that by March and April of 1943, the moment when the wolf packs were staging what should have been their greatest triumph, the very environment they hunted in had been fundamentally altered by forces they could not see coming. A U-boat commander who had learned his trade fighting convoys in 1941 and 1942, where wolf pack tactics had worked with almost mechanical precision, found himself now in a war that was qualitatively different. The weapons and sensors he faced were not merely more numerous. They were of different kinds, and they hit at the very foundations of his tactical system. He could not shadow without surfacing and dying to radar. He could not attack on the surface without facing aircraft. He could not dive deep without facing hedgehog attacks. And he could not rely on his radio to maintain pack formation without inviting detection by direction-finding gear that had become far more efficient than it had been months earlier. The Wolfpack system had assumed U-boats would operate relatively freely on the surface at night, that they could rely on their search receivers to alert them to danger, that they could dive to safety when threatened, and that they could maintain radio contact across enormous distances without catastrophic risk. Every single one of those assumptions had been invalidated simultaneously. What made this transformation particularly devastating was its cumulative nature. No single new weapon was a war winner by itself. Centimetric radar was powerful, but not absolute. The Lee light was terrifying, but required successful radar contact first. Hedgehog was lethal, but only against a detected submarine. Escort carriers doubled air coverage, but could not protect a convoy from every approach. Very long-range aircraft could not cover every mile of ocean, but operating together, each one reinforcing the others, each one closing off tactical options that U-boats had previously exploited, they created a new reality. A commander making tactical decisions in April 1943 was facing possibilities that looked radically different from those confronting his colleague making similar decisions in April 1942. The change was not gradual, it was sharp, almost discontinuous, a phase transition where the entire system flipped from favoring the attacker to favoring the defender. The sophistication of this transformation should not be understated. This was not simply a matter of more guns or bigger ships. This was a coordinated assault on the technological, tactical, and organizational foundations of the Wolfpack system, each element designed to address specific vulnerabilities that had been revealed through 2 years of combat. The centimetric radar answered the problem of U-boats detecting their own detection. The Lee light answered the problem of U-boats hiding in darkness. The Hedgehog answered the problem of U-boats diving to refuge. The escort carriers answered the problem of gaps in land-based air cover. The expanded training answered the problem of crews who did not understand their own equipment. These were not happy accidents or fortunate conjunctions. They were the products of analysis and hard thought, of decisions made by people who understood that the campaign was failing and that new approaches were necessary. The scientists and engineers and operational commanders who designed and deployed these systems had done so with the specific knowledge of what they were fighting against. They had studied the Wolfpack system, understood its assumptions and vulnerabilities, and built a technological and tactical response that was almost surgical in its precision. By April 1943, that response was operational and integrated into escort doctrine across the Atlantic. What followed in May would be the most decisive month in the entire history of the U-boat campaign. A reversal so sharp and complete that it seemed less like the continuation of a struggle and more like its conclusion, disguised as a temporary tactical retreat. The wolf packs that had hunted convoys with impunity would suddenly find themselves hunted. The hunters would become the hunted, and the technological balance that had for so long favored the attacker would shift decisively and permanently toward the defender. #Black May. The Atlantic in spring of 1943 was no longer the hunting ground it had been. The waters that had belonged to the wolf packs through the winter were becoming a trap, closing around them with each passing day. As April turned to May, the technological and organizational advantages that had accumulated on the Allied side began to compound in ways that would shatter the entire German offensive system in a single month of catastrophic losses. What happened in those 30 days was not merely a tactical reversal. It was the visible collapse of a strategic vision that had seemed, only weeks before, capable of strangling the British Isles into surrender. The men in the U-boats, many of them veterans of years at sea, would experience something they had not encountered before, the sensation of becoming the hunted rather than the hunters, of losing the tactical advantage that had defined their war. The new technological arsenal in Allied hands was operating at full effect by this point. The centimetric radar mounted in escort vessels could detect a submarine on the surface at distances of 10 to 15 kilometers, and the U-boat crews possessed no passive detection equipment that could warn them of its presence. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight that could be deployed from Avro Lancaster and Consolidated Liberator aircraft in the final seconds of attack, meant that night, which had always been the U-boat's sanctuary, had become a zone of acute danger. The ahead-throwing Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar could place explosions in a spreading pattern ahead of a diving submarine, increasing the probability of a lethal hit at depths where the older patterns of depth charges had been almost useless. Improved tactics within the escort groups meant that attacks on single U-boats now often resulted in coordinated assaults from multiple vessels, with fresh escort ships arriving from other positions in the convoy screen to press the attack to exhaustion. The British destroyer escorts and corvettes, manned by officers and men who had spent 3 years learning their trade in the harshest possible school, now moved with the precision of an orchestra that knew every note. American escorts, arriving from the other side of the Atlantic in increasing numbers, brought the resource of a nation fully mobilized, with fresh crews and vessels that had not been ground down by years of continuous operations. The first of the May convoy battles erupted around an eastbound convoy, designated SC-130. A German patrol line had made contact, and the commander at the headquarters of BDU, the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, had ordered the assembly of a wolf pack to converge on the target. What should have been a devastating coordinated assault, instead became a running battle in which the escort commander was able to maintain a perimeter that the U-boats could not penetrate. The escort's HF/DF equipment, the high-frequency direction-finding apparatus that could locate the source of a radio transmission, meant that every signal sent by the German boats to coordinate their attack was itself a beacon that drew escort vessels toward them. The fundamental mathematics of the Wolfpack system, which had depended on the coordination of silent concentration before striking in overwhelming force, had been inverted. Now the very act of coordination exposed the attacking submarines to destruction. 4 U-boats were lost in this battle. 4 crews, totaling roughly 200 men, gone in the space of hours, dispatched to the bottom by escorts that now possessed the tools and the knowledge to kill with efficiency that had seemed impossible only months before. As May progressed, the losses accelerated. A westbound convoy moving toward North America encountered another wolf pack, and in the fiercest convoy battle of the entire month, 6 U-boats were sunk and others damaged so severely that they were forced to break off and retreat. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone with the capacity to read it. The escort carriers, small aircraft platforms carried on merchant hulls that could launch fighters and anti-submarine aircraft with a range sufficient to cover the mid-Atlantic gap, were operating as mobile bastions of air power that had no parallel in the earlier years of the campaign. The very long-range liberators, those four-engined giants that could fly 1,000 kilometers from their bases in Iceland and Scotland, were now appearing with such regularity that U-boat commanders learned to dread the moment when they spotted the silhouette of a heavy bomber rising above the horizon. The acoustic torpedo, that innovation which Dönitz had hoped would allow U-boats to strike back at their tormentors, proved either to be ineffective or required the launching U-boat to remain in positions where it could be attacked before it could achieve the safety of depth. The weapon became a liability rather than an asset. Men who had survived years of patrol now were killed before their new equipment could prove its worth. The shock waves of these losses reverberated through the German submarine service with force that was almost physical. The U-boat arm had built itself and had been constructed in the eyes of the German military and the German population as an elite force. The selection standards for submarine service were among the highest in the Wehrmacht. The training pipeline was rigorous and exhausting, and those who passed through it were regarded, rightly, as among the finest naval officers and men that Germany could produce. Many of the men commanding U-boats in the spring of 1943 were veterans of multiple patrols, officers, and enlisted sailors who had accumulated professional knowledge through experience in conditions that had not prepared them for the scale and coordination of the death that now surrounded them. The loss of experienced commanders was particularly catastrophic. A U-boat captain carried not merely his own skills, but the accumulated tactical doctrine, the learned instincts about positioning and approach and evasion that made a boat and its crew effective. As these men were killed in rapid succession, experienced commanders with years of service, they took with them knowledge that could not be transmitted to younger, less seasoned captains in time to matter. The training system could produce new crews, but it could not instantly produce the veterans that the campaign now demanded. By the middle of May, Dönitz was confronting a crisis of a scale that had no precedent in his command. The monthly loss rate of U-boats had reached a level at which the replacement construction, impressive though it was, could barely keep pace. More precisely, the losses were approaching the point at which the human cost of sustaining operations in the North Atlantic could no longer be justified by any rational strategic calculation. The wolf packs had not merely failed to sink significant tonnage during the crisis months. They had suffered destruction while attempting operations that had become suicidally dangerous. The carefully constructed doctrine of coordinated operations, which had taken years to develop and refine, had been rendered obsolete, not by clever tactical innovations from the escorts, but by the simple multiplication of escorts' firepower through new technology and new tactics operating in conjunction. The very thing that had made the wolf packs effective, their ability to maintain radio contact and coordinate their movements, had become the instrument of their destruction, as the radio signals that coordinated attacks also announced positions to vessels and aircraft that could reach those positions with lethal force before the attack could be pressed home. Dönitz's response was a decision that shook the entire German naval structure. On the 4th of May, 1943, he ordered the wolf packs withdrawn from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The U-boats would redeploy to other areas, to the Caribbean, to the waters around Iceland, to distant theaters where they might continue the war against Allied shipping with less catastrophic loss rates. The order itself was an unspoken admission of defeat. For the first time since the opening moves of the campaign, the strategic initiative had passed completely from German hands to the Allies. The man who had built the Wolfpack doctrine, who had believed that coordinated submarine assault could strangle Britain into submission, was now ordering the dismantling of his own system. It was not an order that came without anguish. The communications that flowed from BDU to the U-boats operating in the Atlantic carried the weight of a commander who understood that the battle was being lost, but who could not accept the logic of withdrawal without attempting to maintain morale and fighting spirit in an arm that was suffering losses of a scale that would, if continued, see the entire U-boat force consumed within months. In the radio messages that Dönitz sent to his captains, there was an attempt to maintain the fiction that the withdrawal was tactical rather than strategic, a regrouping rather than a retreat. The boats would gather their strength, would integrate the new weapons systems that were emerging from German shipyards, would return to the convoy routes when conditions had been restored to something more favorable. The submarine force had not failed. The conditions of warfare had simply changed, and the response had to be commensurate with those changes. Yet even as these messages were transmitted, the men receiving them understood their true meaning. The operational orders of May 1943 represented a line from which there would be no clean return. The British Isles would continue to receive their convoys. The supplies that had seemed so desperately vulnerable would continue to flow. The German strategic objective, the strangling of Britain through the destruction of merchant shipping, had failed to achieve fruition. The window of opportunity, it seemed, had finally closed. The pace of losses in the final days of May was relentless. One after another, U-boats that had been cornered by escort groups and aircraft were sent to the bottom. Some were destroyed by surface action alone, overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from multiple escorts firing guns and explosives with a coordination that the submarine crews had not encountered before. Others were caught on the surface by aircraft and forced into diving sequences that did not allow them to maneuver with any freedom before being attacked again. Their hulls shattered by depth charges, dropped with precision that seemed almost calculable in its effect. A few managed to escape and limp back toward European waters, with their crews traumatized by their experience, spreading the word through the U-boat flotillas that the North Atlantic had become incompatible with the tactics that had worked the year before. The losses of 40-plus U-boats in a single month was not merely a numerical catastrophe. It represented the destruction of a tactical system, the invalidation of an entire operational philosophy, and the confirmation that industrial capability and technological innovation, when mobilized and focused with purpose, could overcome even the most skillfully executed tactical operations. What the crews who survived that terrible month carried back with them was a transformed understanding of what submarine warfare now meant. The confidence that had been palpable in the earlier years, the sense that the U-boats possessed a decisive weapon and that history was moving in their direction, had been shattered. In its place came a different kind of fatalism, one that would characterize the final years of the campaign. The men who sailed from their bases knew that their chances of returning had declined catastrophically. The patrol that had once been regarded as a challenging but manageable operation had become a lottery, with survival as the hoped-for outcome rather than the expected one. The psychological contract between Dönitz and his men, that aggressive commanders who pressed attacks would survive to press them again, had been violated in a way that no mere order could repair. The best tactics, the most aggressive commanders, the finest crews, were now being killed with regularity that made a mockery of the doctrinal assumptions that had underpinned the entire campaign. Yet paradoxically, Dönitz and his subordinates continued to order operations, even as they recognized the catastrophic conditions in which those operations were being conducted. New boats were being produced at an accelerating rate, driven by the priority that Germany's leadership assigned to submarine construction. The crews manning those boats were necessarily less experienced than those they were replacing. The training pipeline could not simultaneously maintain the standards of selection and produce the quantity of bodies that were now required. These newer commanders and crews were dispatched into waters where experienced veterans were being killed with sobering regularity. The strategic logic, if it can be called that, was that the new generation of submarines, equipped with superior technology and driven by Dönitz's insistence that the campaign must continue, might yet turn the tide. The Type 21 electro-submarine was entering production, a revolutionary boat that could operate at speeds and depths that existing Allied anti-submarine weapons could not effectively counter. The acoustic torpedo was being refined. New flak armaments were being installed on boats that would return to the surface. The doctrine was being adapted, and Dönitz's communications with his force took on the character of a commander who was demanding that his men continue to fight, despite conditions that were objectively becoming worse rather than better. The transition from May to June of 1943 represented the true pivot point of the Atlantic campaign. The wolves had been driven from the fold. The convoy system, which the Admiralty had contemplated abandoning only weeks before, not only survived, but thrived. The escorts and aircraft that had learned their trade through 3 years of bitter experience had demonstrated that they possessed the capability not merely to defend against U-boat attacks, but to inflict upon them losses of a scale that made continued large-scale operations in the North Atlantic a luxury that Germany, with all its industrial struggles and manpower shortages, could no longer afford. The strategic initiative, which had seemed so much in German hands during the happy time and the crisis of March, had passed completely to the Allies. It would not pass back. The U-boats would continue their war, but it would be a war conducted from positions of declining strength, against opponents whose advantages, technological, organizational, and logistical, would only increase. The reckoning that had begun in Black May would compound through the remaining 2 years of the campaign, until the final U-boat patrols of May 1945 were little more than memorial voyages, undertaken in a nation that was already defeated, by men who fought not because victory was possible, but because an order had been given, and the habit of obedience, even unto death, remained unbroken. The night of May 23, 1943, was the moment Karl Dönitz's world fractured. By the dawn of the following day, he had received the reports that forced him to make a choice that would haunt him and cost him thousands of lives.
The wolf packs that had terrified the Atlantic were being hunted and slaughtered.
Experienced commanders were vanishing. Boats that had survived 2 years of war were being sent to the bottom in a matter of hours. The system he had spent a decade perfecting, the coordinated assault from multiple vectors that had come so close to breaking Britain, had stopped working. The technological advantage he had once held, the U-boat as a surface predator that could strike at night and dive away before dawn, had evaporated in the spring sunshine. At that moment, Dönitz faced a fundamental crisis of strategy. He could withdraw, rebuild, and wait for new weapons that would restore German superiority, or he could do what his iron will and his pride demanded. He could order the boats to keep fighting, to adapt and innovate, to prove that the U-boat arm would never surrender. He chose to fight. That choice would extend the campaign's agony for nearly 2 more years. The technological response began immediately in the German research establishments, in the drawing offices and factory floors that were still functioning despite the mounting weight of Allied bombing. Dönitz and his technical advisors understood precisely what had changed. Aircraft were everywhere now, equipped with radar systems the Germans had not anticipated, able to strike in darkness and in fog. The surface attacks that had defined the Wolfpack tactic were no longer viable. The U-boats needed new weapons to strike back, to make the cost of hunting them prohibitive. The first of these innovations was the acoustic torpedo, a weapon born from desperation and German ingenuity working in tandem. The device was designed with a revolutionary principle. Instead of requiring a U-boat commander to aim at a target ship and calculate angles of attack with the traditional spread of conventional torpedoes, this new weapon could home in on the noise of a ship's propellers, seeking out the acoustic signature of the prey itself. Once fired from a U-boat, the acoustic torpedo needed only to be directed into the general path of the target convoy's escort vessels. In the best scenario, it would lock onto the destroyers and corvettes protecting the merchant ships, thinning the escort screen and leaving the freighters vulnerable. The psychological impact was intended to be equally valuable. British and Canadian escort crews would know that their own machinery now made them targets, that the very power plants that propelled them through the water had become potential death sentences. The development of the acoustic torpedo revealed the hidden cost of the May catastrophe. German engineering could innovate at remarkable speed, but the time required to design, test, produce, and deploy new weapons meant there would be months of vulnerability. The first acoustic torpedoes were not ready for service until late 1943, and they carried their own fatal flaw. The weapon's seeker was highly sensitive to the roar of its own boat's engines, and U-boats attempting to use the acoustic torpedo had to maintain a degree of silence that made them easy prey for the very escort vessels they were trying to kill. Worse, the Allies quickly understood the threat and developed acoustic countermeasures, simple devices towed behind escort ships that broadcast false propeller noises, confusing the torpedo's seeker and drawing it away from the actual target. By the time these countermeasures became widespread, the acoustic torpedo had consumed critical manufacturing capacity and limited pilot production runs that might have been devoted to other innovations. The weapon that was supposed to restore the U-boat's killing power had instead become a symbol of the cruel mathematics of technological competition. German innovation would always arrive too late, and Allied manufacturing capacity would always overwhelm it. The improvements to anti-aircraft armament represented a different kind of response, one born from a harsh tactical reality that Dönitz and his commanders had learned in blood. U-boats caught on the surface by aircraft could not escape through diving. They were too slow underwater. If they were going to survive the transition from the Golden Age to the new era of hunter-killer groups and coordinated air and sea assault, they needed to be able to shoot back. The Type 7 U-boat and the larger Type 9 vessels began being retrofitted with progressively heavier flak weapons, twin and quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft guns mounted on the conning tower, adding firepower that had not been there before. Some boats even experimented with 40mm weapons. The U-boat's commanders and gunnery officers were trained in anti-aircraft tactics, taught to hold their position on the surface and fight through the initial aircraft attack rather than diving immediately. It was a desperate gamble. An aircraft attacking with bombs or rockets would be unstoppable if the U-boat had to stay surfaced and vulnerable, and the added weight of the flak armament subtly reduced the boat's underwater performance. But against lone aircraft or lightly armed patrol planes, the flak guns occasionally worked. There were documented cases of U-boats damaging or even shooting down attacking aircraft. These rare successes were celebrated and publicized within the U-boat arm, providing morale reinforcement in an increasingly grim operational environment. Yet the victories were statistical outliers. More often, the addition of flak armament simply meant that the U-boat fought longer on the surface before being sunk, slightly prolonging the agony rather than preventing the inevitable. The schnorkel represented a far more sophisticated technological response, a device that would prove genuinely transformative if it had arrived sooner, and if Germany had possessed the time to retrofit it widely across the fleet. The schnorkel was a simple concept in principle, a tube with a valve that extended above the waterline and allowed a submerged U-boat to draw air for its diesel engines and expel exhaust. A submarine equipped with a schnorkel could run on diesel power while remaining beneath the surface, maintaining underwater mobility and avoiding detection by radar. The Dutch had actually developed the technology before the war, and the Germans had captured examples in 1940. But German naval engineering took years to perfect the design, to solve the problems of sealing and valve operation, and to test the system's viability in operational boats. The first schnorkel-equipped U-boats did not enter service until late 1943, after the May catastrophe had already occurred. The device seemed to promise a revolution. U-boats fitted with schnorkels could operate in areas where they were heavily hunted, remaining underwater for prolonged periods, and thus protected from radar detection and air attack. They would be slower underwater than on the surface, but they would be alive. For commanders fighting in the closing months of 1943 and throughout 1944, the schnorkel became the difference between marginally survivable patrols and near-certain death. Yet the schnorkel carried hidden liabilities that neither Dönitz nor his engineers fully anticipated. The valve mechanism was noisy, producing acoustic signatures that Allied sonar operators could detect at considerable range. The tube itself occasionally developed ice at high latitudes, blocking the air intake and forcing U-boats to surface to clear it. The device fundamentally altered the tactical environment of U-boat operations, creating a situation in which boats were slower, more vulnerable to the new sonar technology, and yet unable to fight back effectively because they were running underwater and most of their firepower was mounted on deck. The schnorkel-equipped U-boats of late 1943 and 44 would sink considerably fewer ships than the surface hunting packs of the Golden Age, and they would suffer proportionally higher losses. The weapon was a survival tool, not an offensive system. It represented Dönitz's strategic retreat, disguised as technological innovation. The true hope for restoring German naval supremacy lay in the Type 21 submarine, a design so revolutionary and so advanced that it would render all existing submarines, German and Allied alike, obsolete within a matter of years. The Type 21 was powered primarily by a battery-driven electric motor rather than diesel engines, giving it far superior underwater speed. Where a conventional Type 7 could reach perhaps 9 knots when submerged, the Type 21 could achieve more than 17 knots, meaning it could actually chase down and hunt convoy escorts or attack ships at speeds faster than many destroyer escorts could manage. The design incorporated streamlined hull forms that reduced underwater drag, improved torpedo storage and fire control systems, and incorporated so many innovations that German engineers regarded it as a leap into the future. If the Type 21 had been available in 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic might well have proceeded very differently. If it had been available in 1943 during the May crisis, it might have allowed Dönitz to weather the catastrophe and regenerate offensive capability. But the Type 21 was not going to be available in significant numbers until mid-1944 at the earliest, and the delays in the German production system meant that only a handful would actually enter service before the war's end. This was the cruel reality that confronted Dönitz. He possessed the blueprint for a weapon that might have restored German advantage, but the design would not reach operational status for months or years, during which the existing boats would continue to be hunted and sunk at accelerating rates. The production crisis that surrounded the Type 21 exposed the fundamental constraints that had begun strangling the German war machine. Construction of the new U-boats required the cooperation of multiple factories, the manufacture of specialized electrical equipment, and integration of fire control systems that were themselves under development. German shipyards were simultaneously being asked to build Type 21s, while continuing production of conventional submarines, maintaining existing vessels, and conducting the retrofitting programs that were supposed to keep the old boats competitive. Dönitz placed enormous pressure on the builders to accelerate the timeline, and some boats were indeed delivered ahead of original schedules. But the demands of the Nazi regime pulled resources in multiple directions. U-boat construction competed for steel with tank production, for electrical equipment with armored vehicle plants, for labor with the underground fighter aircraft factories being relocated out of range of Allied bombing. The Type 21 represented German engineering at its peak, but it represented German logistics at their breaking point. Each Type 21 that was completed consumed resources that might have kept 3 conventional submarines operational. The strategic question that Dönitz never adequately confronted was whether it made sense to sacrifice the present fighting strength of the U-boat arm in order to build a revolutionary future that might never arrive in usable quantities. This dilemma created the tragic dimension of Dönitz's command during 1943 and 44. He understood that the conventional U-boat era was ending. He understood that new weapons and new designs were necessary if Germany was to maintain any hope of contesting the Atlantic. Yet he also possessed the personality and the professional identity to demand that his men continue fighting with the weapons they had, even as those weapons became increasingly inadequate. The crews boarding U-boats in the autumn of 1943 knew with statistical certainty that they were unlikely to return. The casualty rates among U-boat crews exceeded those of almost any other branch of the German military, higher than the Luftwaffe pilots, higher than the tank crews of the Panzerwaffe, higher than the infantry assault troops. Dönitz celebrated their sacrifice, awarded decorations to survivors of lost boats, and maintained the protocol and ceremony that gave meaning to their deaths. He also continued sending fresh crews, many with minimal training and almost no chance of survival, into an operational environment where experienced boats were being sunk in convoys and individual transit passages with terrifying regularity. This was not callousness or ignorance on Dönitz's part. It reflected a calculation he had made. If he withdrew the boats and waited for the new generation of weapons to arrive, he ceded the Atlantic entirely to the Allies. If he kept the boats fighting, even knowing the losses, he maintained German presence, tied down Allied escort assets, and preserved the fiction that the U-boat arm remained a strategic force. The question was never whether men would die. The question was whether their deaths would have meaning. The cycle of German innovation and Allied countermeasure became faster and more frantic as 1943 proceeded into 1944. Each new German weapon arrived on the operational scene, already partially understood or quickly countered by Allied technical teams. The acoustic torpedo had been neutralized by noisemakers within weeks of its first use. The improved flak armament gave some boats a fighting chance, but not enough to shift the balance decisively. The schnorkel allowed boats to survive in areas where they would otherwise have been trapped, but it also made them slower and more vulnerable to improved underwater detection systems. The Type 21 remained in the future. Meanwhile, the Allies themselves were not standing still. Convoy escorts were being equipped with new sonar systems, improved radar, and better anti-submarine weapons. Aircraft were being modified with more powerful weapons systems. Support groups and hunter-killer task forces were being created with more vessels and more sophisticated coordination. The escort carriers that had proven so devastating in May 1943 were being mass-produced, and the very long-range Liberator bombers were finally being allocated to Coastal Command in sufficient numbers to close the Black Pit. The technological race that Dönitz had begun with such confidence in the 1930s, the conviction that U-boats could win a war of attrition against surface navies, was being lost in the factories and laboratories of an enemy whose industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. By the late autumn of 1943, Dönitz was forced to acknowledge that the immediate situation had become unsustainable, but his response revealed the limits of his vision. He withdrew the main wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes, a grudging admission that coordinated pack tactics could no longer function against the new Allied defenses. Instead, he dispersed the boats to peripheral areas and established what he termed distant waters operations, sending U-boats to the Mediterranean, to waters around the Cape of Good Hope, to the Indian Ocean, even to the Far East. These distant operations would continue throughout 1944 and into 45, sinking ships, tying down Allied escort resources, but never generating the tonnage war calculations that had been the strategic objective of the North Atlantic campaign. The boats operating in distant waters were sacrificial in a way that the North Atlantic fleet had not been. They faced long transits through waters now thoroughly dominated by Allied forces, and their return rates fell below even the catastrophic standards of the North Atlantic during the crisis months. Dönitz was not abandoning the U-boat campaign. He was transforming it into a war of attrition that he was losing more completely with every passing month. The decision to accelerate Type 21 production while simultaneously attempting to regenerate offensive capability with existing boats created a vicious feedback loop. Dönitz could not simply tell his crews to stop fighting and wait for new weapons that might arrive in 6 months or a year. The institutional identity of the U-boat arm was wrapped up in offensive action, in the pursuit of tonnage and the sinking of Allied ships. To Palm. By the spring of 1943, the mathematics of survival had shifted in ways that no amount of U-boat captains' courage could overcome. The wolf packs that had dominated the Atlantic had become predictable, not because they had grown careless, but because their very operational method, the coordinated surfacing at night, the radio transmissions to headquarters, the convergence on convoy positions, created a signature that the Allies had learned to read and to answer. The hunters, it would soon become clear, were about to discover what it felt like to become hunted. The transformation was not sudden. It arrived in phases, each one bleeding into the next, each one stripping away another layer of the tactical advantage that had sustained German submarine warfare through the dark months of 1942. What had begun as a defensive response to convoy attacks was evolving into something far more dangerous to the U-boats, a sustained, intelligence-guided offensive that brought the war to the submarines themselves, regardless of whether they were attacking, transiting, or waiting on station. The escort carrier marked the true turning point in this reversal, though few understood its significance immediately. These were improvised vessels, many of them converted from merchant hulls or built on limited displacement, their flight decks crowded and their aircraft complements modest. Yet, they possessed something the U-boats could not counter effectively: persistent air cover that could extend hundreds of miles from the formation it was designed to protect, and more crucially, the ability to hunt rather than merely defend. The Royal Navy had been operating escort carriers in limited numbers since early 1942, but it was not until the United States began introducing its own converted and purpose-built carriers in substantial quantities that the concept became truly formidable. By mid-1943, hunter-killer groups were forming around these vessels. Flexible task forces, built around a single escort carrier, with a screen of destroyers and frigates, armed with the latest anti-submarine weapons and equipped with aircraft that carried centimetric radar invisible to German detection equipment. These groups were not constrained by convoy schedules or bound to a single track across the ocean. They could operate independently, positioned by intelligence estimates ahead of known U-boat movements, or dispatched to sweep areas where activity had been detected. They existed for a single purpose: to find and kill submarines wherever the ocean could be searched. The mechanics of intelligence-driven positioning made these hunter-killer groups exponentially more effective than their simple numerical strength might suggest. Bletchley Park's growing ability to decrypt German naval radio traffic provided Allied commanders with an unprecedented window into U-boat deployment schedules, Wolfpack concentration areas, and operational orders from Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote headquarters. This was not perfect knowledge. There were still gaps, still periods when German cipher changes left the Allies temporarily blind. But it was sufficient to build a probabilistic picture of where U-boats were likely to be at specific times. The hunter-killer groups were positioned to exploit that picture. A support group might receive orders to steam toward a particular grid square in the Atlantic, based on intelligence that a U-boat transit line was expected to pass through it. The carrier's aircraft could then conduct search patterns across that area, their radar-equipped swordfish biplanes, or wildcat fighters, ranging far beyond visual distance, to probe the ocean